March 2009. A heavy atmosphere hung over the abandoned Mayfield farm, about 12 miles from Grand Island, Nebraska. The beams from the construction workers' headlamps cut through thick dust, landing on the cracked concrete of a World War II-era silo, a place that should have contained nothing but rubble and memories. Central, we've located an unusual object beneath the old silo foundation. Requesting the coroner's unit, the supervisor's voice crackled over the radio, piercing the thick spring silence of Nebraska. What began as a routine demolition job had just become something else entirely. Something that would finally answer the question haunting Hall County for 67 years. A set of human remains lay buried beneath the concrete, and right beside them, a glass jar labeled headlamps and a rotted scrap of fabric, items no one expected to find here. The same hydroline jar Helen Mayfield was said to have carried the day she vanished in the summer of 1942. For nearly 7 decades, Helen's disappearance had been an unanswered void in the Grand Island community. A quiet young woman who suddenly vanished while riding her bicycle home from church. A house left with lights burning all night. A cup of tea that never had time to cool. And after that, absolute silence. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit like and subscribe. Your support is what brings these forgotten cases back into the light, and the algorithm will make sure you don't miss the next episode. The discovery beneath the Mayfield silo wasn't just the end of a missing person case, it was the first domino in a chain of events that would unearth secrets buried for nearly 7 decades beneath the quiet Nebraska plain. Because when authorities finally identified a suspect, and for the first time in the 2009 report, put a name to the person responsible, it wasn't a stranger, not a drifter, not a roadside predator. It was someone the entire community had trusted. Someone who had stood beside Helen in her final days, someone who had lived among them for more than half a century, with a horrific secret buried right beneath the farm. The Mayfield case isn't just a solved mystery, it's proof of the persistence of investigators who refused to let files gather dust, of modern forensic advances that gave a voice back to a victim, and of the relentless efforts of those who still believed the truth would eventually come out. It's also the story of a community torn apart. When Helen vanished in 1942, suspicion spread like wildfire across the Nebraska prairie. Neighbors eyed each other warily. Some families stopped speaking altogether. The brief but desperate search for Helen exposed small cracks in the town, cracks that would shatter when the truth finally surfaced nearly 7 decades later. What makes this case especially haunting is the answer was always very close. The prime suspect had appeared in the original investigation, sat across from police, answered every question, and then melted back into ordinary life, as if he'd never been involved. For decades, that person attended Helen's memorial services, talked to neighbors about the old loss, looked into the eyes of those who grieved the most, and maintained an innocent facade while hiding a secret no one could have imagined. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I'm always curious how far these stories travel and how they connect us. Tonight, we're going back to the summer of 1942, tracing Helen Mayfield's final footsteps, and seeing how one quiet disappearance became one of the most shocking cold cases in Nebraska history. This is a story of loss, deception, relentless pursuit, and justice delayed, but never denied. Summer of 1942. Nebraska was drenched in the gold of corn and the smell of cracked, dry earth. The whole state was feeling the effects of the war. Young men had gone to the front, leaving small towns to be run by women and the elderly. Grand Island, in the heart of the plains, was one such community. Dusty roads winding past farms, a train whistle, echoing every morning, and weathered wooden houses with tin roofs standing silent in the hot wind. The Mayfield farm sat isolated on the southern edge of town, where Helen Mayfield, a 28-year-old widow, had lived alone since her husband, a railroad engineer, was killed in Europe. Helen rarely went out, only to church every Sunday and to the general store once a week. People said she was quiet, the kind who only smiled when neighborhood kids passed by. On July 17th, the evening service at St. Paul's Lutheran ended just before 8 o'clock. Helen sat in the back pew, spoke to no one, and quietly slipped out before the choir sang the final hymn. A few people saw her pedaling her old bicycle down the dirt road toward the farm, her pale blue dress growing smaller against the sunset. When full darkness fell, the lights in Helen's little house were still on. From half a mile away, Ruth Keating, the community nurse and neighbor, saw the glow flickering through the corn and assumed Helen was reading, as usual. But by midnight, the lights still hadn't gone out. The next morning, Ruth walked over and knocked. No answer. The front door was ajar, the house silent, the bicycle propped neatly on the porch. On the kitchen table sat a cold cup of tea and a folded dish towel. Ruth called out several times, walked through the rooms, then froze in the empty living room. A cold, unmistakable feeling of wrongness settled over her. She turned, hurried back to the porch, picked up the receiver of the wall telephone connected to the Grand Island switchboard, and through the faint static said simply, "I need to report a missing person." On the other end, the Hall County Sheriff's dispatcher repeated the words in the weary tone of routine, jotted them on the duty log, and passed the note to Sheriff Harold Whitman. The wall clock read just past 10 in the morning. Summer sunlight slanted through the dusty windows. Whitman, a man in his mid-40s with graying hair, was no stranger to missing persons in rural areas. Drunks sleeping it off, wives running to relatives in Iowa. But the short note, "Lights on all night, door open, no one inside," made him pause. Around here, people didn't leave lights burning overnight without reason. He called his deputy, Earl Danner, nearly 10 years younger, careful and quiet, put on his khaki jacket, and left the office. The sheriff's gray Plymouth rolled out of downtown Grand Island and headed down red dirt roads, shimmering in the noon heat. The Nebraska sky was bleached white, corn tassels bowing in the dry wind. Neither man spoke the whole 10-plus miles. When they arrived, Ruth Keating was waiting by the wooden gate, her green dress dusty, eyes ringed from a sleepless night. She pointed toward the house. The lights were still on this morning. Whitman nodded and signaled Danner to note the exact time they officially began processing the scene. The small wooden house stood alone in the clearing, its tin roof flashing sunlight like a cold mirror. Starting at the front door, they examined the hinges, frame, knob, and lock. No pry marks, no scratches on the latch, lock fully functional. A thin layer of dust at the threshold meant no heavy recent traffic. Danner measured distances from the door to furniture and noted every item in the living room: sofa, coffee table, bookshelf, all perfectly aligned, no signs of disturbance. Whitman moved to the kitchen, opened upper cabinets, plates and cups neatly stacked. The silverware drawer was tidy. No fresh grease or dust. He checked the floor. Clean, no stains, no broken glass, no footprints. The sink was dry, no wet towels. On the table, the cold teacup still carried a faint scent of mint leaves. The old refrigerator hummed. Inside were milk, eggs, and half a loaf of bread. Food not yet spoiled, meaning Helen hadn't planned to be gone long. Whitman wrote, "Food fresh, no signs of packing." Danner went to the small bedroom. On the nightstand, an open Bible and reading glasses. Bed neatly made, pillows arranged, no body impression. He checked the closet. Small suitcase, dusty and locked. Summer clothes folded. No luggage prepared. Danner reported, no indication of departure. Whitman moved to the little office next door. Wooden desk, oil lamp, a few bills, a Parker fountain pen. Desk drawers held writing paper and unused envelopes. No letters ready to mail. All personal papers in order. Office window shut tight, hinges solid, no scratches on the walls. Beside the door, an empty coat hook, evenly dusted. He carefully opened the back door to the yard at 12:47. Blinding sunlight poured onto the floorboards. Hot wind carried the smell of ash. Whitman crouched to examine the step, faint small shoe prints, possibly female, pointing outward. In the yard, dry grass cracked underfoot. A brick path led toward the old barn. They followed it, scanning both sides of the fence. No drag marks, no dropped items. Behind the house stood the grain silo, stark against the sun. Whitman approached a patch of ground behind its base. The soil color was different, smoother, more compacted. He knelt, tapped it lightly with his pen. Hard and dry but mixed with fresh sand. Nearby, a few black flecks of ash, possibly from burned trash. He asked Danner. The neighbor said she burned trash here, make a note. Danner nodded and wrote, suspicious area, recently compacted soil, approx. 3.5. They took 3 photographs and numbered the scene. No blood, no obvious evidence, no old dig marks. Wind from the cornfields sent fine dust swirling around them. Back on the porch, Whitman had Danner sketch the overall layout. They measured distances from the front door to the barn, silo to fence, marking every checkpoint. The scene diagram clearly showed the main house, yard, silo, barn, and direction to the highway. Whitman signed it and clipped it into the temporary file. He stood quietly for a moment, staring out at the distant fields where sunlight made everything shimmer like thin smoke. Everything here was too quiet, too clean, nothing extra, nothing missing. And that very neatness felt deeply wrong. Danner packed the camera and closed the evidence bag. Both men took one last look at the house before driving away. Nothing stirred but the wind and the faint metallic creak of the hot tin roof, like a silent warning that this story was far from over. Back in Grand Island that afternoon, Whitman and Danner spent the rest of their shift canvassing anyone who might have seen Helen in the last 24 hours. They started at the small general store on the main street, where Ruth Keating bought supplies for both households. The owner, Clara Hines, over 50, recognized Helen Mayfield's name immediately when Whitman showed his badge. She said Helen was a regular, usually coming Tuesday mornings for milk, sugar, and cigarettes. When asked the last time she saw her, Clara was certain it was Friday morning before church. She bought coffee and brown sugar, said she was expecting company. Whitman asked if anyone was with her. Clara shook her head, then remembered. But the next morning Ruth came in. I joked that Helen must have gone to Lincoln. She didn't laugh, just said, I hope so. He noted the time, 8:30 Saturday morning. Ruth was in town, more than an hour before calling police. The note got double underlined. Next, they tracked down the 13-year-old paperboy from South Locust, Stanley Reed, who lived half a mile from the Mayfield place. The kid stood knee-deep in road dust, clutching the handlebars of his rusty bike. Danner asked if he'd seen Helen or anyone else around the house that evening. Stanley said no, but remembered Saturday morning while delivering papers. There was a green pickup in the yard near the barn. Whitman pressed, You sure? The boy nodded, said he noticed because the tires had mud on them, different color from the local dirt. I saw Miss Ruth come out, holding a metal bucket, like she was cleaning something, he added. When I came back, the truck was gone. Danner and Whitman exchanged a quick glance. Ruth's morning statement only mentioned stopping by at 8 to drop off medicine. She never mentioned a truck. Whitman wrote, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, Ruth Keating at farm, green pickup present. They thanked the boy, told him to keep quiet, and headed to St. Paul's Lutheran. The church sat on a low hill north of town, its copper bell glinting in the late sun. Pastor Joseph Adler, tall and thin, let them in. When asked about Friday evening service, he remembered clearly. Helen arrived earlier than usual, sat in the very back. I noticed because she was always late. She spoke to no one and left before the final hymn. She walked out alone, wearing a blue jacket, west door. I checked my watch, about 10 minutes to 8. Whitman asked if anyone followed her. The pastor shook his head. Danner noted, left church 1950, alone, blue jacket. On the drive back to headquarters, Whitman reviewed the notes. A timeline was forming. 1950, left church, rode home, house lights on overnight. 8 o'clock next morning, Ruth at the farm. 8:30, Ruth at the store. 9:58, missing person call. But Ruth's statement that morning claimed she only stopped by after noticing Helen wasn't up. If she was already there before 8, she had discovered the disappearance nearly 2 hours before reporting it. Whitman pulled over, flipped through the pages, compared handwriting. Clara placed Ruth in town at 8:30. Stanley put her at the farm around 8 o'clock. The official call came at 9:58. Nearly 2 hours unaccounted for. He drew 2 red lines under the times and asked Danner, "Notice anything odd?" Danner replied, "If she was at the farm at 8, she already knew Helen was gone when she got to the store. Yet she said nothing to anyone." Whitman fell silent, staring through the windshield at the endless golden corn. The numbers didn't add up, but the pieces were starting to fit his gut feeling. Something was very wrong. They returned to the station as the sky turned bronze, light slicing sideways across the brick buildings. In the office, Whitman spread every note across the desk and drew a timeline. Friday, 1950. Helen leaves church, 2010. House lights on. Saturday, 8 o'clock. Ruth at farm, 8:30. Ruth at store, 9:58. Police notified. Beneath it in blue ink, he wrote, "Discrepancy in statements requires verification." As Danner closed the logbook, the wall clock struck 6. Outside, sunset bathed the tin roofs of Grand Island. The town was so quiet you could hear the westbound train whistle, echoing across the empty plains, long and dry like a lost breath. The next morning, Whitman filed the preliminary report and requested a wide area search around the Mayfield property. A team was quickly assembled, 8 deputies, 4 local militia, and 3 volunteers from the farm co-op. Hot wind blasted the fields as they gathered at the farm gate. Whitman stood beside the Plymouth, spread a paper map over the hood, and assigned sectors. Danner took the east, cornfields, and low ground toward the railroad tracks. 2 officers swept south toward the old well and barn. The rest searched around the abandoned sheds. Volunteers carried shovels, picks, and borrowed K9 dogs. No one spoke, only wind whipping the corn and metal tools clanking. The Nebraska sky blazed white, heat rising in waves off the ground. Whitman led the main group along rows of shoulder-high corn, scanning every furrow. The smell of dry earth mixed with distant diesel from the highway. Every few minutes he stopped, looked around, marked the map. Farther east, Danner used binoculars on the irrigation ditch running toward the tracks. The old rails were overgrown, no recent footprints or slide marks. He noted, no recent activity. South of the house, 2 officers checked the abandoned well, about 100 yards out. They lowered a flashlight on rope. The weak beam showed only still water and floating wood scraps. One militiaman muttered, "Too deep. If anything went in, it ain't coming up." Whitman had them mark it but not dig. He moved to the barn, smell of moldy straw and damp wood. The door hung open, inside only bare framing, rusty nails, and an old water trough. Dirt floor covered in rotted straw, no fresh drag marks or footprints. He stepped back outside, eyes settling on the silo again. The ground around its base was unusually hard and flat. A patch, several square yards wide, recently compacted. Whitman approached, crouched, studied closely. In the dust and gravel was a narrow curved groove, narrow truck tire track, not deep but distinct. The kind left by a small 1-ton farm truck. He measured 4.5 inches wide and noted direction. It ran from the yard edge, curved behind the silo, then vanished into low ground. Danner was called over. No braking marks, means it was moving slow, possibly stopped here. Whitman agreed, ordered photos. An officer set up the Graflex, loaded film, took 3 shots from different angles. Whitman labeled the film, "Truck tire marks, south direction, 15 feet from silo." He staked wooden markers at each end of the track. Wind was already dusting it over. They covered it with a tarp. The teams fanned out again. Along the west fence, a volunteer found a small beige fabric scrap, caught on barbed wire, frayed edges, faint blue embroidery. Whitman bagged it. No evidence tag yet. Source unknown. By noon, the sun was a furnace. Sweat soaked Whitman's sleeves. He returned to the rally point, where Danner was updating the search map. Preliminary report. No body located. No obvious items. Only finding small truck tire marks, near silo, direction unclear. One volunteer asked, "Could she have left by train?" Whitman shook his head. No ticket, no luggage, not enough evidence. He looked out over the fields where golden corn rippled like ocean waves. Everything looked untouched, as if Helen Mayfield had never left, just dissolved into the air and the white Nebraska sunlight. As the search team gradually dispersed from the farm, Whitman and Danner stayed behind to finalize the last report of the day. The sunlight had softened. The sun hung low in the west, stretching the silo's shadow across the flat ground. While Danner walked along the north fence line to double-check the markers, he noticed a small glint reflecting off a sagging strand of barbed wire. He crouched, pushed aside the weeds, and slowly pulled out a small beige object, caught between two coils. It was a woman's thin cloth glove, dust-darkened, with a line of slanted green embroidered letters on the cuff that clearly read, H.M. Whitman came over, slipped on leather gloves, and carefully lifted it from the fence so the fabric wouldn't tear. He examined it in the late light. The glove was intact. No rips, no blood, no dirt beyond a few clinging blades of dry grass. Danner paced the distance from the discovery spot to the silo, 42 steps, due north. Whitman opened a special paper evidence bag, placed the glove between two sheets of wax paper, sealed it, labeled it, Evidence #3, cloth, glove, H.M. Fence north, signed it, folded the bag, and placed it in the sealed box along with the recorded coordinates. Then he took 3 more photographs of the fence section, including the hooked wire, making sure every angle of the scene was covered. When the camera flash fired, tiny dust particles floated in the air. A moment later, Danner used a metal tape to measure the height where the glove had been caught, 3 feet 7 inches, adult arm reach. Whitman stood still for a few seconds, staring toward the wooden house, wondering why a glove would turn up in the opposite direction from the main exit. No one remembered seeing Helen wearing gloves when she left church. He noted in his book, evidence matches victim's initials, 70% probability it belongs to her. Before leaving the scene, he ordered the entire fence section cordoned off with marking tape, so neither livestock nor passers-by could disturb it. By the time everything was done, the sun had slipped behind the fields and dusk painted the horizon red. They left the farm carrying the day's only piece of evidence. At the Hall County Sheriff's Office technical room, Whitman handed the glove to fiber analyst Louise Hammond, who ran the county's small forensic lab. She took the bag, broke the seal under the desk lamp, and examined every thread with a magnifying glass. The glove was fine cotton, the kind sold in women's stores in Grand Island. No tears, only slight fraying on the index finger. With tweezers, she removed a tiny fiber and checked it under the optical microscope. No hair, no skin flakes, no foreign dust. After recording the preliminary findings, she resealed the bag and placed it in storage. Her brief report, sent back to Whitman, read, no blood traces, no foreign fibers, no mechanical damage. He read it, folded the paper, and sat motionless for a moment. Everything was too clean in a way that felt wrong. In his leather-bound notebook he wrote, Evidence #3, condition pristine. No signs of violent contact. Compare with victim's personal items. Standing beside him, Danner asked quietly, could the wind have blown it there? Whitman only shook his head slightly. No. The barb was hooked from the inside. Someone either placed it there, or it got caught, while someone was passing through. He closed the notebook and looked out the window at the darkening sky. On the desk, the small evidence bag lay quietly, its fresh seal gleaming under the yellow light, the handwritten H.M. standing out boldly. It was the first, tiniest yet clearest proof that someone named Helen Mayfield had once been here before she vanished into the Nebraska summer of 1942. Monday morning, Whitman went to the Farmers and Merchants Bank in downtown Grand Island to review Helen Mayfield's recent transactions. Branch manager Samuel Price recognized the name the moment he saw the file. He opened the ledger and turned the handwritten pages in black ink. Helen's account had been active since 1940, with a modest balance of about $268 and no withdrawals in the past 3 weeks. The last transaction was payment of the electric bill on June 26. No withdrawal slips, no transfer orders. Whitman requested certified copies, sealed and signed. Then he stopped at the post office. Clerk Mrs. Ellison unlocked the undelivered mail drawer. Nothing outgoing, or any packages under Helen Mayfield's name. He asked about incoming mail the previous week. She showed him 2 advertising circulars and 1 notice from the power company, all already delivered. Nothing indicated contact outside the area. At the Union Depot ticket counter, Whitman showed Helen's identification photo. The agent shook his head repeatedly while checking the ticket logs for Lincoln, Omaha, and Des Moines on July 17 and 18. No one had bought a ticket under the name Mayfield. He checked the Greyhound bus lists, same result. Danner arrived later with notes from the power company confirming the July bill was still unpaid, meaning Helen had no plans to be gone long. Whitman checked off each item on the list. Bank, no withdrawals. Post office, no outgoing mail. Transportation, no tickets purchased. Utilities, normal activity. He stared at the summary and underlined the temporary conclusion, no signs of planned departure. To be certain, that afternoon he returned to Helen's house with a list of every major store in town. In the kitchen, on the wooden table, he found a small red-covered expense notebook. The last entry, dated July 16th, read, "Coffee and soap, 18 cents. Nothing else." Flipping back, last month, $4 for sewing machine repair, $1.25 for pain pills. No debts paid, no deposits, no large amounts. Every entry was small and routine, reflecting the quiet, frugal life of a woman with no intention of change. Danner checked the workroom desk drawers and found 3 unpaid bills and 1 empty envelope. No outgoing letters, no unfamiliar addresses. Whitman placed the red notebook in an evidence folder labeled Personal Expenses. Helen Mayfield. As they left the house, he paused on the porch, looking out at the cornfields darkening under the sunset. Dry wind whipped dust around the eaves. He understood that if someone planned to leave town, even for a few days, some trace would remain, an expense, a ticket, a phone call. Here there was nothing. She hadn't withdrawn money, bought a ticket, told anyone, or mailed a letter. Whitman opened his notebook and wrote in block letters, "Voluntary departure, unlikely." He closed it, slipped it into his pocket, and turned away from the silent house. The Plymouth's headlights cut through the dusty lane as the 2 men drove off, the beams sweeping across the tall corn swaying in the wind, illuminating fields that showed no trace of movement. Only silence and a case file that had grown a few pages thicker in the Hall County Sheriff's archives. That same afternoon, after finishing the review of Helen's accounts and documents, Whitman and Deputy Danner returned to Ruth Keating's house to take her formal statement. Ruth's small wooden house stood less than half a mile from the Mayfield farm, nestled between 2 rows of old poplars. When they arrived, Ruth was watering flowers, moving slowly, her face showing nothing but constant weariness. Whitman greeted her, showed his badge, and asked to speak inside. Ruth led them into the living room, where the grandfather clock ticked steadily. He opened his notebook and began with basic questions. "When did you last see Helen?" Ruth answered immediately, voice clear. "Saturday morning, around 8. I brought her some medicine, talked for about 5 minutes, then left." Danner followed up, "Did you go back?" Ruth shook her head, eyes lowered. "No, I was busy cleaning the chicken coop. It wasn't until nearly 10 that I noticed her lights were still on, so I called the police." Whitman jotted quickly, then turned to his earlier note about Stanley Reed, the paperboy who said he saw Ruth at the farm around 8 o'clock, along with a green truck parked near the barn. He mentioned casually, "The paperboy says he saw a strange truck in the yard while you were there. Did you see anyone?" Ruth looked up briefly, eyes narrowing, then answered slowly, "No, he must be mistaken. I walked over, there was no truck." Danner glanced at Whitman and wrote in the margin, "Denies presence of truck." Whitman continued about that morning. "Did Helen seem normal? Did she mention going to Lincoln?" Ruth hesitated, then said, "Yes, she talked about looking for work, but not when she'd go. I just thought she needed a change of air." Her voice stayed even, no tremor, but her hands gripped the tablecloth so hard the knuckles went white. Whitman watched closely, but said nothing. He shifted to the timing of the police call. "Why wait until nearly 10 to report it?" Ruth shrugged. "I thought she'd gone to town early or was visiting someone." "Helen did that sometimes," Danner asked. "But you saw the lights on all night. Why not check then?" Ruth replied curtly, "I didn't notice. It was windy. I stayed inside." Whitman stopped writing and looked up. "That evening, did you hear any vehicle or unusual noise?" Ruth answered firmly, "No, it was completely quiet." The room felt thick. Only the dry, steady tick of the grandfather clock remained. After a few minutes of silence, Whitman closed his notebook and softened his tone. "Mrs. Keating, you knew Helen better than anyone. If there's anything at all that worries you, please tell us. Even something small matters." Ruth pressed her lips together, then shook her head slightly. "There's nothing. I think she just needed to get away." Whitman held her gaze a few seconds, nodded, and gathered his papers. As they reached the door, Ruth saw them out with a faint smile that didn't hide her relief. Danner got in the car first. Whitman paused on the porch, glancing at the fence where the wind scattered white petals. As he climbed in, he wrote in his pocket notebook, "Unusually calm demeanor. No display of worry. Prepared-sounding responses. Timeline conflicts with witnesses Reed and Hines." On the drive back, they barely spoke. Danner reread the notes aloud in a low voice. "She never asked what we found or offered to help, like she was just waiting for the right questions." Whitman didn't reply. Sunset stretched orange across the dirt road, the light glowing on the car windows. He opened his notebook again and wrote the final line of the interview. "Statement consistent internally, but conflicts with witnesses. Maintains calm, avoids elaboration. Recommend behavioral surveillance." He closed the book, slipped it into his coat pocket, and kept his eyes on the long red dust road ahead, where night was slowly covering the endless Nebraska fields, and Ruth Keating's silence had become an inseparable part of missing person case hash. 241. 2 days after questioning Ruth Keating, Whitman and Danner returned to the Mayfield farm to re-examine every detail inside the house, hoping to find something missed during the first search. Mid-July Nebraska sun beat down. Red dust coated the path. When they opened the door, the air still carried the lingering scent of old tea mixed with damp wood, the house's signature smell. Whitman went straight to the small workroom he had only glanced through before. He knelt, opened the bottom right drawer, and found a jumble of papers, mostly utility bills and expense notebooks. At the very bottom lay an ivory envelope, unsealed, with scrawled blue ink writing, "To Ruth. Leave this if I'm away." Inside was a single folded sheet, handwriting neat, beginning, "Dear Ruth. I've decided to go to Lincoln for a few days. Need to look for work and get a change of air. I'll write once I'm there. Please keep an eye on the house. Helen M." In the lower left corner was a simple signature, heat-shaped, slanted, M round and even, matching the style Ruth had once described. Whitman read it 3 times, then silently placed the letter on the desk. Danner glanced over and said softly, "If it's real, maybe she did leave on her own." Whitman didn't answer. He took evidence tongs from his briefcase, slid the letter into a plastic sleeve, and labeled it Evidence Hash 4, handwritten letter. Workroom. He searched further, no other envelopes, no other letters in the same handwriting. Before leaving the scene, he ordered the handwriting sample rushed to the state lab in Lincoln for comparison with Helen's bank signature cards. 2 days later, the reply arrived in an envelope, stamped State Forensic Office. Comparison between the sample signed Helen M. and bank signature records shows multiple similarities in slant and letter spacing. However, due to ink quality and minor differences in pen pressure, authenticity cannot be confirmed or ruled out. Whitman read slowly, his eyes darkening. He set the report down and tapped his pen lightly against the file edge. An inconclusive result meant forgery could not be excluded. Danner looked at him. "If she really wrote it, what are we still looking for?" Whitman looked up, voice measured. "If it was her, Why leave an unsealed letter, and why in the very bottom drawer, where no one would see it unless they searched thoroughly? He opened his notebook and added, "Letter possibly planted to stage voluntary departure scene." Danner flipped through the enlarged signature photos. They each trembled slightly. The connection between letters broken, rare in normal signatures. Whitman pulled Helen's bank statement from his pocket and compared them under the desk lamp. The letter's handwriting was soft and slow, the bank signature sharp and decisive. He pointed it out to Danner. Whoever wrote this tried to copy her but lacked the habit of pausing at the top of the each. "This is someone else's writing?" Danner asked. "Whose?" Whitman didn't answer. He simply folded the paper carefully, locked it in the metal cabinet, and that day wrote in the report, "Handwritten letter, content. Leaving for Lincoln. Signature similar to victim's but shows signs of imitation. Conclusion, authenticity undetermined. Note, suspected planted post-disappearance to steer investigation toward voluntary departure." That evening, as he left headquarters, Whitman paused on the steps, lit a cigarette, and watched the yellow streetlights spill across the empty road. In his mind he kept seeing the small room, the drawer buried under old papers, and the letter placed just cleverly enough to be accidentally discovered. People who want to erase traces usually leave nothing. People who want to mislead always leave something, just enough to seem believable, just enough to make others stop looking. He ground out the cigarette and walked down the steps, carrying the quiet feeling that something was starting to crack in what had seemed an ordinary missing person case, now that the notebook line, "Voluntary departure unlikely," faced a piece of evidence staged with sophisticated care. The Lincoln forensic report pushed the case into a dead end. Whitman spent the following days reviewing the entire file, reorganizing statements, maps, and scene photos. Everything pointed to the same blur. Helen Mayfield had vanished without a trace, without confirmed witnesses, without clear signs of crime. Her house, sealed for nearly a month, had grown cold. The old curtains stayed drawn, thick dust on the tables showed no one had entered in weeks. Danner completed the final verification list. Train depots, boarding houses, and hospitals in the area had no record of anyone named Helen Mayfield. The bank balance remained unchanged. No contact, no letters, no relatives elsewhere. Whitman stared at the wall chart, where the timeline was marked in red ink. 7/17, left church, 7/18, reported missing, 7/21, first search, 7/23, handwritten letter discovered. At the bottom was a blank line waiting for a conclusion. He stood there a long time, then added in blue ink, "No body recovered, no suspect. Insufficient grounds for criminal case." Danner, sitting nearby, looked into his cold coffee. "We've got nothing left to follow," Whitman answered briefly. "Not yet." His voice was hoarse but firm. They both signed the summary report and sent it upstairs to the county sheriff's office. At the final meeting of the investigation phase, only 3 people were present: Whitman, Danner, and the Hall County prosecutor. The report was read in 10 minutes. The conclusion stated clearly: no evidence of crime, no basis for prosecution, no new witnesses. The prosecutor leaned back, tapped his pen on the desk, and said simply, "Then we close it for now. Status: unresolved." Whitman nodded without protest. He knew that in the paperwork system those 2 words meant the case would be filed away until new evidence appeared. But to a detective, it was a silent failure. No one said it, but everyone felt it. The next day Whitman returned to the Mayfield farm one last time to remove the seals. The wooden door creaked dryly. Summer wind blew fine dust through the rooms. He walked once around the house, looking through every window, at every object. Everything remained exactly where it had been, as if time had stopped the night Helen disappeared. Before leaving, he stood on the porch and wrote a few short lines in his pocket notebook. No determined beginning or end. Scene intact. Conclusion: disappearance of unknown cause. Then he closed the notebook, walked straight to the car, and did not look back. The old Plymouth rolled slowly down the dirt road, leaving behind a cloud of dust that settled over the Mayfield house sign. That afternoon at Hall County Sheriff's headquarters, file #241 was placed in the 3rd metal drawer, the outer label reading, "Missing person, Helen Mayfield, status unresolved." Whitman affixed the seal, shut the drawer with a soft metallic click in the quiet room, sat down, removed his hat, and looked at the final report on his desk. Beneath the typed line, "Investigation suspended," he added one last pencil note. No body, no suspect, only emptiness. He folded the paper, slipped it into the folder, and closed it. Outside the window, sunset spread red across the streets. A freight train from Omaha sounded its long whistle into the distance. Helen Mayfield's disappearance was officially shelved in the summer of 1942, while Nebraska kept spinning through its wartime rhythm, and one small name sank silently among hundreds of other files, without resolution, without closure, bearing only the cold notation, Case Hash 241, unresolved. In the spring of 1943, nearly 8 months after case file Hash 241 had been placed on temporary hold, the Hall County Sheriff's Office received a supplemental report from the State Crime Lab in Lincoln. The document arrived late, delayed by wartime backlog that had pushed countless civilian matters to the back burner. Whitman opened the sealed envelope and pulled out a 3-page report stamped March 4, 1943. The findings were no different from the preliminary version. Insufficient basis to conclude that the handwriting and signature in the letter purported to be from victim Helen Mayfield are forged. Similarities in stroke characteristics, spacing, and slant remain within natural variation limits. Conclusion: forgery cannot be established. Whitman read it through without expression. He set the pages aside and looked at the photograph of the letter clipped to the file, where the line, "I have decided to go to Lincoln for a few days," sat neat and clean, so clean it struck him as unreal. He picked up his pen and added a short note in blue ink at the bottom of the cover sheet. Possible runaway. It was the phrase he knew his superiors wanted to see, a soft, acceptable way to close an unsolved disappearance. Danner had already been transferred to railroad security, leaving Whitman the only one still holding the key to the file cabinet. He straightened the entire stack: search reports, Ruth Keating's statement, photographs of tire tracks, the glove examination, the handwriting analysis. Everything was pressed into a single hard folder, tied with cloth tape, and stamped closed, 1943. When the metal cabinet door shut, the old hinges echoed through the empty room. Whitman stood staring at the cold row of drawers, dozens of other files marked unresolved, stacked like paper graves. He took off his hat, sat down, pulled the last cigarette from the pack, lit it but didn't smoke, just let the flame burn short and die. Outside the window, spring snow fell thin, melting the moment it touched the ground, carrying road dust and the smell of damp coal. He folded his hands and tapped a quiet rhythm on the desk edge, eyes resting on the words he had just written, possible runaway. It was now treated as the final word, a silent confirmation that Helen Mayfield had simply left of her own accord, even though he had never believed it. When he left the office, Whitman locked the door, slipped the key into the pocket of his heavy coat, and walked straight out into the light Nebraska snow, his figure gradually disappearing, carrying the feeling that the disappearance had been closed only on paper, never truly ended in the minds of those who had once touched file number 241. In June 1943, as Helen Mayfield's disappearance slowly faded from memory, the Hall County Register of Deeds office accepted a land transfer packet concerning Parcel 27, South Locust District, the very acreage of the Mayfield farm. The applicant was Ruth Keating, the neighbor and close friend, known to be the last person who saw Helen before she vanished. The paperwork was complete. A power of attorney to sell the property bearing the signature Helen Mayfield, notarized by a private law office in Lincoln, and dated May 2, 1943. The notary affirmed that the signatory presented valid identification and signed in my presence. Everything was so perfectly legal that no one raised a question. The sale price was $1,800, fair market value for a small farm. The buyer was a farmer from Aurora who paid by bank check and the transaction was fully recorded in the county ledger. When word reached the Hall County Sheriff's Office, Whitman received only a copy from the Register of Deeds with the note, "No evidence of fraud, transaction lawful." He studied the Helen Mayfield signature at the bottom of the power of attorney, comparing it to the copy in the old file. The handwriting looked the same slant, same pressure, but there was a slight difference in the hetch. The loop was longer, the ink unevenly thick. He examined every stroke under a magnifying glass, lips pressed tight. Danner was long gone, so Whitman alone added a note to the original cover sheet. Power of attorney for land sale, notarized in Lincoln. Verify notary source if case reopened. Even as he wrote it, he knew no one cared anymore. That year Nebraska was focused on wartime crop production. Local police were short-staffed and underfunded. An old missing woman file was no longer a priority. Whitman folded the copy, slipped it into the folder, but couldn't shake the strange feeling. Helen had said she was going to Lincoln to look for work. Then 8 months later her signature appeared in that very city authorizing Ruth to sell her only asset. He turned on the desk lamp, pulled out last year's handwriting report, and laid the two documents side by side, the note left in the house and the land transfer form. The writing matched almost perfectly, same slant, same line spacing, same emphasis on the mem. If the letter had been suspected of forgery, then this power of attorney could not be genuine either. Whitman wrote a few more lines of comment, then sealed both documents in an envelope marked related to 1943 land transaction. He intended to question Ruth again, but a few days later, when he went to her house, it was locked tight, curtains drawn, mailbox empty. Neighbors said Ruth had left Grand Island at the beginning of June, sold the house, and no one knew where she went. Someone at the grocery store recalled her mentioning moving to live with relatives in Kansas City, but wasn't sure. Whitman walked around the empty house, past the withered wild daisies in the yard and the dusty path, then stopped at the fence where they had found the glove embroidered the year before. He stood there a long time while the wind whipped up dust from the fields, carrying the smell of young corn. When he returned to the office, he filed the supplemental note under the heading, "Ruth Keating left Grand Island. No forwarding address, land transfer valid per state records. Insufficient legal grounds for further investigation." The note was retyped and added to file hash 241. That day Whitman closed the casebook once more, writing a final line in pencil. If Helen really signed, she was in Lincoln. If not, that signature is the period at the end of the truth. When he shut the cabinet, Nebraska had moved into summer. Hot winds swept the town as it did every year, and the name Helen Mayfield had nearly vanished from everyone's memory. Everyone except the old detective who still held the key to the metal cabinet containing the disappearance that was never solved. After Ruth Keating left Grand Island, Helen Mayfield's disappearance drifted into oblivion, surviving only in dusty ledgers and the scattered recollections of those who once worked the case. In 1945, under a statewide reorganization of judicial archives, all unresolved cases from smaller counties were transferred to the Central Repository in Lincoln. Among more than 800 backlogged files, case number 241, missing female Mayfield Helen, was classified under unresolved pre-1945 cases. A clerk named Marion Cole signed the transfer receipt with a brief note, evidence handwritten letter, glove, scene photographs, search map, land transfer document, condition fair. On October 14th, the metal box was sealed and placed on shelf 3, row B, room 6 of the Nebraska State Archives. From that point the case lay dormant. Through the 1950s, as the state focused on post-war economic recovery, civilian investigation budgets were slashed, and files involving no body, no suspect, like Mayfield's, were quietly treated as closed. There were no requests for review, no complaints from relatives, no one who mentioned Helen's name for decades. During occasional inventory checks, archivists simply noted, "No change, file intact." The evidence was wrapped in old paper bags that yellowed with age. The letter signed Helen M. remained in its plastic sleeve. The blue ink blurred, the paper brittle enough to tear at a touch. The glove embroidered HM had faded, its green thread turned pale gray. The photographs of tire tracks behind the silo were fogged by light and heat. Everything slowly sank into the yellow of time. In the 1960s, when the state archives moved to a new building on North 10th Street, Box 241 was transferred along with hundreds of others. A new clerk unfamiliar with the history mistyped the label from missing person to property, inheritance. That error sent the Mayfield file to the property section instead of criminal investigations. For nearly 20 years no one touched it. Whitman died in 1958. None of his successors ever mentioned his case. Danner, discharged from service, had lost contact with law enforcement. Both men who once knew the details were gone. By the late 1970s, the archives began digitizing old records. Prioritizing criminal cases with suspects, missing persons files were marked. No action required. Number 241 was mixed among thousands of unsorted folders, its cover corner stained, the word Mayfield almost illegible. A young clerk doing inventory wrote in red pen, "No retrieval requests from 1945 to present." And so, for more than 60 years, Helen Mayfield's disappearance existed only as a folder weighing less than 2 pounds, lying silent among cold metal boxes. No voice, no claimant, no one left who remembered a woman who vanished in the Nebraska summer of 1942. A case never solved, surviving only as an obsolete name under a layer of dust in the state's administrative catalog. In October 1981, in the town of Kearney, 50 miles from Grand Island, Ruth Keating died at age 71 after a mild stroke. She had lived alone in a small house on 2nd Avenue, childless and unmarried, with only distant relatives in Hastings arranging the funeral. The death certificate listed natural causes, nothing unusual. While cleaning out her belongings, her niece, a young woman named Carol, found a worn brown leather notebook in an old wooden desk drawer. Inside were miscellaneous notes, medication lists, monthly expenses, a few addresses. On the last page, a scrawl in blue ink caught everyone's attention. "No one is to break up the silo foundation." There was no further explanation, no date, no context. Carol showed the notebook to her father. He shook his head. She was probably afraid the ground would cave in. That foundation's been there forever. They flipped through the other pages, but found nothing noteworthy. The notebook was tossed into a box with the rest of her papers. No one realized the note referred to a farm silo, abandoned nearly 40 years earlier south of Grand Island. Ruth was buried simply in Kearney Cemetery, beneath a small stone bearing only her name and dates of birth and death. On the funeral home's records, her occupation was listed as homemaker, no immediate family. None of the relatives remembered or knew about the time Ruth had lived on South Locust, and no one had ever heard the name Helen Mayfield. For a brief time, the notebook was kept, then it too slipped into oblivion, like its owner. In Grand Island, the Mayfield farm had changed hands many times. The silo Ruth once mentioned still stood, overgrown with weeds and broken brick, just another ordinary part of the old landscape. No one paid attention to it, just as no one remembered the woman who once lived next door, the woman who carried that small secret for the rest of her life. While file hash 241 gathered dust in the state archives, Ruth Keating's death was recorded only in the Kearney Vital Statistics Ledger, a short line among thousands of names, and no one suspected that the final scribble in her old notebook would turn out to be the only remaining clue from a disappearance forgotten for nearly 4 decades. In September 1982, 40 years to the day after Helen Mayfield vanished, the former Mayfield farm was leased by a local agribusiness company to build a new grain storage facility. Renovation began with the demolition of the old silo. The concrete cracked, covered in green moss and thick weeds. On the morning of September 18th, as the excavator dug beneath the foundation, operator Mark Heller spotted small white bones protruding from the damp soil. At first he thought they were animal remains, but when the bucket turned over more earth, The rounded shape of a human skull became clear. He immediately signaled the machine to stop and called the foreman. When the supervisor arrived, they saw ribs, spine, and part of an arm still connected, buried roughly 2 feet beneath the old concrete slab. Nearby lay a badly dented tin box, heavily rusted, and a discolored scrap of cloth fused to the dirt. Heller pried open the tin with a screwdriver. Inside was a small glass bottle, label faded, but readable. Hodrolin, and the faint print ophthalmic solution, 30 milliliters. Another worker recognized it as a common eye drop brand from the 1940s. They stopped work immediately and called the Hall County Sheriff's Office. The call reached headquarters at 10:12 a.m. Lieutenant Raymond Stiles, head of the crime scene unit, arrived with 2 evidence technicians. The area had already been cordoned off by the workers with nylon tape. All machinery was shut down. Stiles ordered everyone to leave objects exactly where they were and requested a forensic anthropologist from Lincoln. Under harsh sunlight, the team erected a tarp for shade and marked the discovery zone with steel stakes. The skeleton lay on its side, head facing southwest, arms slightly bent, pelvis mixed into the soil. Stiles noted in the log, adult human skeleton, probable female, burial depth, 60-70 centimeters, covered by concrete slab. Adjacent, tin box containing hydroline bottle and cotton fabric fragment. Technicians began brushing away soil with small brushes. After nearly 2 hours, they had recovered enough bones to map the full body. Around the neck area, they found shards of glass beads, possibly a necklace. One technician commented, "Bones are friable, but anatomical order is intact, buried in place, not moved." Stiles ordered full photographic documentation and numbered the evidence. #1. Remains. #2. Tin box. #3. Hydroline bottle. #4. Fabric fragment. #5. Bead necklace. While clearing the edge of the pit, an officer noticed crazing cracks in the concrete, clearly showing the silo foundation had been poured on top of the burial site. He added, "Old concrete, circa 1943-1944. The coincidence went unspoken. When the Lincoln forensic team arrived early that afternoon, the site was fully secured. Police set up temporary barricades and kept press and onlookers away. All construction was suspended indefinitely. Lead examiner Dr. Edward Nolan personally supervised the excavation. He knelt to examine the skull and noted a small fracture at the left occipital base, possibly from blunt force. The glass bottle was lightly rinsed. Residue remained inside. Cap still tight. Label in old-fashioned script. The bottom was embossed, Lincoln Pharmacy Company, a detail that caught the investigators' attention. The tin box was dented. Its lid bore the scratched initials, Epping crudely carved with a sharp tool. Old and worn but unmistakable. Stiles logged it, signed, and personally sealed all evidence in preservation bags. By late afternoon the scene was cleared, the ground around the silo leveled, leaving only a circular hole in the broken concrete. At dusk the wind swept the field, kicking up gray dust that blurred the site, where workers had planned that morning to pour new footings, now the center of a case buried for 40 years. An urgent report was dispatched that night to the Hall County Sheriff. Bold headline, "Possible human remains. Former Mayfield farm." By the next morning, the area was enclosed with corrugated metal fencing and signs reading "Crime Scene. Do not enter." The town of Grand Island buzzed. Residents gathered at a distance. Many older folks recalled the story of that Helen who disappeared in '42 that they had heard from their parents. By noon, the Hall County Sheriff's Office officially announced, "Human remains discovered beneath silo foundation at former Mayfield farm. Scene secured for forensic identification." Photographs and the preliminary report were sent to headquarters, marking the reopening of file hash 241, a disappearance once considered permanently closed. On the morning of September 19, 1982, the forensic team from the Nebraska State Crime Laboratory arrived at the Mayfield farm to conduct the official excavation. Dr. Edward Nolan, lead examiner from Lincoln, along with 2 forensic anthropologists and 3 field technicians, worked with Hall County deputies in dry wind and temperatures around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The old silo area had been covered with white tarps overnight, surrounded by wooden stakes and rope, marking a 10-meter square. Nolan ordered soil removed in thin layers to preserve stratigraphy. Throughout the morning, the team documented every bone fragment, drew 3 diagrams, and numbered all evidence. They recovered a nearly complete skeleton, missing only the right wrist bones. The skull showed a 3-centimeter fracture on the left occipital. Initial assessment: the injury was perimortem, not postmortem. During excavation, they found a brass button and a small cotton fabric scrap that appeared to match the glove in the old file. Once collection was complete, the remains were placed in stainless steel trays and transported to Lincoln the same day. Nolan's interim report to Hall County stated, adult human skeleton, female, age 25, 30, height 160, 165 centimeters. Degree of decomposition and mineral accretion on bones indicate death approximately 40 years ago, consistent with early 1940s. Fabric fragments were washed in neutral solution for fiber analysis. Natural cotton, hand-woven, common in Nebraska clothing stores of the era. The brass button bore a lotus flower emblem, manufactured by an Omaha women's apparel shop in 1941. Simultaneously, the forensic chemistry unit took soil samples around the grave for residue testing. 2 days later, surprising results arrived at Lincoln Command. 3 separate soil samples showed traces of tetrahydrozoline, a derivative used in eye drops that can cause respiratory failure if ingested. The compound is extremely rare in natural soil and unstable over long periods unless initially present in high concentration. The lab report stated clearly, trace tetrahydrozoline detected, indicating likely presence of a solution containing the substance at the time of burial. Poisoning cannot be ruled out as cause of death. Reading the results, Nolan sat in thought for a long time. He ordered comparison with historical pharmaceutical records, confirming the most common eye drop brand in Nebraska in the early 1940s was sold under the trade name Hydraline, matching the label on the bottle found with the remains. This made chemical poisoning a credible scenario. An emergency meeting was held at the Lincoln lab. Nolan presented, female, age approximately 25 to 30, death circa 1942, 1943. Left occipital fracture, unclear if from impact or mechanical force during burial. Residual tetrahydrozoline suggests victim may have been poisoned prior to interment. Hall County investigators recorded everything and forwarded the report to the sheriff and the state attorney general to reopen the old file. DNA was extracted from femoral marrow for comparison, but 1982 technology was limited. Only gender and blood type could be confirmed. Caucasian female, type O. From 1942 Grand Island census data, only 2 women in that age range had disappeared without explanation, one of them Helen Mayfield. When Nolan examined scan negatives from the old file, he noted the glove embroidered. HM matched the color and weave of the fabric scrap found beside the body. He wrote, high probability of identity with victim in case #241. That same afternoon, the team collected samples of the old silo concrete to date the top layer. Carbon analysis showed the concrete covering the body was poured between 1943 and 1944. Matching the recorded date Ruth Keating filed the land transfer documents. The final 8-page report was sent to Hall County titled, Human Remains, Female, Estimated Age 25, 30, Death circa 1942, 43. Trace of tetrahydrozoline, likely homicide. As the new file was created, Whitman had already been dead more than 20 years, yet his name remained under original investigator. In Grand Island, people talked over coffee at the old diner, retelling the story of Helen Mayfield, who disappeared and came home in the ground. Meanwhile, the numbers and findings were neatly typed, clipped into a fresh folder, and the case, buried for 4 decades beneath cold concrete, entered a new chapter. Immediately after the forensic report was delivered, the incumbent Hall County Sheriff, Michael Garner, officially ordered the reopening of case hash 241, the disappearance of Helen Mayfield, now reclassified as homicide investigation. On September 23, 1982, he personally contacted the cold case unit of the FBI office in Omaha, requesting technical and manpower support. The FBI approved the request within 48 hours and assigned Special Agent Thomas Calloway, a 46-year-old expert in archival case analysis and historical forensic investigation, with more than 20 years of experience handling dormant federal cases, including the successful resolution of several decades-old war crime files, to lead the coordination team. Calloway arrived in Grand Island on September 25, carrying a single suitcase of files and a portable tape recorder. In the Hall County Sheriff's Office, inside the old room with its rusted iron safe, Garner personally handed him the metal evidence box labeled Mayfield, Helen, Missing Female, 1942. Calloway lifted the lid and gently brushed the thick layer of dust from the yellowed cardboard covers. Inside were dozens of handwritten reports, negatives, field maps, and faded photographs taken with a Graflex camera. He turned each page slowly, reading carefully and making notes with a mechanical pencil. Under the harsh fluorescent light, faint blue ink lines emerged. Ruth Keating, last witness, handwritten letter signed Helen M. Quote, comma. Embroidered gloves HM, tire tracks, southbound. Calloway underlined every detail and separated the 3 items of evidence that directly matched the 1982 excavation findings. When he reached the entry, voluntary departure unlikely, his eyes lingered for a long time. He asked Garner, who was the original lead investigator. Garner replied, Harold Whitman, died in 1958. No one ever picked it up after him. Calloway nodded, then requested full access to all 1942, 1945 administrative records, including land transaction files, bank reports, and the copy of the power of attorney for the land sale submitted by Ruth Keating. 3 days later, the FBI technical team set up a temporary mobile office in the Hall County Courthouse, bringing microfiche readers, document magnifiers, and backup equipment. Calloway began working like an archaeologist, uncovering layers of administrative history. He cross-referenced the timeline. Helen disappeared in July 1942. The power of attorney was signed in May 1943. Ruth left Grand Island shortly afterward. Between those 2 dates, the silo foundation had been poured with fresh concrete, a timing that matched the carbon analysis. He created a comparison chart of 3 documents, the Helen M. letter, the power of attorney, and bank signatures. Preliminary magnification analysis revealed all 3 used the same dark blue ink, similar ink flow, and repeating stroke patterns in the letter M. Calloway noted, high probability same author, Ruth Keating. He requested Ruth Keating's known handwriting samples from the 1981 Kearney civil file for comparison. While awaiting results, Calloway reread Whitman's original notes. He realized Whitman had suspected both the letter and the power of attorney were forged, but lacked sufficient evidence. A handwritten line, if not her, someone made it for her, was circled in red. Calloway leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the old wall map where a red ink circle still clearly marked the silo area. He took a red pen and redrew the diagram, connecting the points with bold lines. Location of the gloves, direction of tire tracks, burial site, all lying on a single straight axis. In his first internal report to Omaha, he wrote, high probability victim killed at or near the silo, then buried and concealed under concrete. Premeditated act, not random. The only person with legal access to the land after 1942 was Ruth Keating. When Garner read the assessment, he looked at Calloway and said, if you're right, we're talking about a deliberate murder hidden for 40 years. Calloway simply replied, and legalized on paper. He requested the entire file be transferred to Federal Oversight Review status to prevent any further loss. That same week, the FBI flew in a document analysis team from Quantico. Using ultraviolet light, they confirmed the ink on both the letter and the power of attorney shared the same chemical composition, Parker brand produced in 1942, uncommon after 1943. This discovery reinforced the theory that both documents were created within the same narrow time window, possibly days after Helen vanished. When the results arrived, Callaway quietly wrote in his notebook, Case #241, reopened 1982, direct link to Ruth Keating. He closed the file, looked out the window at the cornfields ready for harvest under endless golden sunlight. 40 years had passed. What had once been labeled missing unknown cause was now unmistakably a meticulously concealed homicide. And in that small room at the Hall County Courthouse, Special Agent Thomas Callaway began the journey of restoring every forgotten detail of the summer of 1942, when it had all started as a pale blue ink report titled Case #241, Missing Female, Possible Voluntary Departure. During his first week in Grand Island, Callaway spent most of his time in the basement archives of the Hall County Courthouse, where Whitman's old ledgers were stored in faded leather-bound notebooks. Wearing cotton gloves to avoid tearing the brittle pages, he turned them carefully. Among the smudged blue entries, one note dated July 20th, 1942, caught his eye. Area behind silo shows freshly leveled soil, possibly recent. Note preserve scene. Re-examine if disturbance noted. In the margin, Whitman had sketched a small rectangle with an X marked south of the silo and added possible burial location or vehicle trace. Callaway laid that page beside the current cadastral map of the Mayfield farm, then placed the 1982 Lincoln Forensic Team's crime scene diagram on top. Using a steel ruler, he connected the coordinates. The line intersected exactly at the 1982 burial pit, off by less than 2 meters. He paused, stared at the maps for several minutes, then exhaled slowly. After 40 years, Whitman's scribbled fountain pen X had proven accurate to within steps. Callaway photographed both documents and sent copies to the FBI cartography unit in Omaha for verification. 3 days later, electronic measurement confirmed the 1942 marked point and the 1982 excavation site matched within an error margin of under 0.8 meters. Extraordinary precision for hand-drawn data. He wrote in his duty log, Whitman suspected the location in July 1942, later confirmed as burial site in 1982. Possible initial excavation considered, but never executed. In the margin of the old report, Whitman had added a faint pencil note, unnaturally flat soil, possibly compacted. Reading it, Callaway felt as though he were conversing with a long-dead predecessor. He pictured Whitman in the midsummer heat of 1942, bending over the ground behind the silo, jotting a few quick lines, then walking away because he lacked legal grounds to dig deeper. From that handwritten line to the grave uncovered 40 years later stretched a perfect chain of logic. Callaway phoned Sheriff Garner with the preliminary finding: the burial location matches exactly the spot Whitman flagged in his very first report. He literally stood on top of the victim's grave without knowing it. Garner was silent for a few seconds, then said only, "We owe him a belated confirmation." Callaway returned to his office and spread out the 1942 crime scene photographs. In one black and white image, Whitman and Danner stood beside the silo. Behind them was the low ground that would later yield the remains. Zooming in, he spotted the faint shadow of the iron fence where the HM embroidered glove had been found, everything aligned as if cast from the same mold. Callaway noted, glove location oriented toward burial pit, consistent with pre-death movement. That evening he returned to the farm, now cordoned off. His headlights illuminated the broken concrete pad. Fine sand blew across it like mist in the wind. He walked the perimeter and stopped at the northern point where Whitman had drawn the X. Kneeling, he measured from the silo base to the fence edge, exactly 15 feet, matching the old notebook figure. A chill ran down his spine, not from fear but from the realization that Whitman had intuited the truth with astonishing accuracy, yet lacked the tools or authority to prove it. Callaway took fresh photographs, then looked into the distance where endless cornfields melted into the night. In the next day's internal report he wrote, Conclusion: burial site exactly matches description in Whitman's July 20, 1942. Whitman likely detected early signs but lacked administrative grounds for excavation. Original tire track and leveled soil references align with concrete pour carbon-dated 1943-44. The report included two overlaid maps, one from 1942, one from 1982, demonstrating near-perfect congruence. When the overlay was printed, Garner pinned it to the large briefing room board beside the words Case #241, reopened. Beneath it, Callaway added a quote from Whitman's note, "If something is under this soil, it will not stay silent forever." The words had been prophetic. 40 years later, they had come true. From that day forward, Case #241 officially entered full criminal homicide investigation status. The focus no longer missing person, but deliberate concealment of a body. In his weekly summary, Callaway closed with a bold-typed line, "The burial site is exactly where Harold Whitman suspected 67 years ago." In October 1982, after completing the map overlay and confirming the burial location match, the Lincoln forensic team moved to the next phase, DNA and toxicology analysis, to establish identity and cause of death. A femoral bone sample from the remains was sent to the University of Nebraska's newly equipped genetics lab. Extraction took nearly 2 weeks because of severe decomposition. The bone had to be demineralized, and the marrow cleaned with EDTA solution. At month's end, the team reported that although nuclear DNA was largely degraded, mitochondrial DNA sequences were sufficiently preserved for maternal line comparison. The Hall County Sheriff's Office issued a statewide request for Mayfield family relatives. 3 weeks later, a woman in Iowa named Margaret Lenz responded that she was Helen Mayfield's niece. Her blood sample was drawn and rushed to Lincoln. On November 18, 1982, the official results were released. The mitochondrial DNA sequence from the bone matched Margaret Lenz's exactly, with a probability of 99.94%. The report concluded, "Remains excavated from Silo Foundation belong to Helen Mayfield, female, born 1914, disappeared July 1942." When Callaway received the certified copy, he stared silently at the boldly printed name. A 40-year missing person case finally answered. But identity was only the beginning. Cause of death was critical. Simultaneously, the forensic chemistry team continued analysis of the liquid remaining in the glass vial found with the body. The hydroline bottle had been stored in a refrigerated unit. Its screw cap had preserved about 1/3 of the original clear liquid. Under spectrometry, analysts identified the primary compound as nearly pure tetrahydrozoline hydrochloride, unconcentrated, at 20 times the strength used in pharmaceutical products. A second control sample taken from soil around the neck area yielded matching results. Abnormally high tetrahydrozoline residue, crystallized, indicating the solution had been poured at the burial site, or the victim had been exposed before burial. The expert report stated, the vial contents could not be standard commercial product. Highly likely reconcentrated for toxic effect. When asked about chemical properties, Dr. James Dalton, head of the toxicology unit, confirmed ingestion of this amount of tetrahydrozoline would induce coma within minutes and respiratory arrest within 15. No suicide scenario permits preparation this precise. The findings were forwarded to Hall County with the conclusion, cause of death: acute tetrahydrozoline intoxication, manner, homicide. Callaway read every page carefully, then typed an interim report to FBI Omaha. Chemical evidence shows victim poisoned with tetrahydrozoline, the active ingredient in hydroline eye drops. Concentration indicates deliberate preparation and use as poison. He pinned 2 photographs to the briefing room board, the original vial and the spectrometry chart. Beneath them, in red marker, hydroline. Key evidence of poisoning. The following day, the investigative team held an expanded meeting attended by Sheriff Garner, 3 technicians, the Hall County prosecutor, and FBI representatives. Calloway presented the full results, pointing to the timeline board, July 1942. Disappearance, May 1943, power of attorney filed. 1943, 1944, concrete poured over silo. 1982, remains and hydroline vial discovered. Toxin in vial matches soil residue. Not coincidence. The prosecutor asked, "Any chance she took it herself?" Calloway shook his head. Impossible. Tetrahydrozoline is odorless and tasteless, but a lethal dose would require at least 20 bottles of hydroline. The victim had no way to prepare that quantity. He paused, then continued. Someone who knew her, knew the house, knew how to pour concrete. Someone who stayed behind after she vanished. The room fell silent. Garner leaned back and said softly, "Ruth Keating." No one answered, but everyone thought the same thing. Calloway opened Whitman's notebook and pointed to the 1943 entry. Ruth submits power of attorney for land sale. He underlined it, then wrote beside it. Timing consistent with concealment activity. After the meeting, he returned to his desk and organized the files into 3 separate folders: identification, toxicology, and property transfer. Each folder pointed to the same conclusion: victim Helen Mayfield, poisoned with tetrahydrozoline, buried beneath the silo, and covered with concrete. In the consolidated report sent to Washington for federal archives, Calloway concluded succinctly, "The case of Helen Mayfield should now be classified as homicide by poisoning, committed circa July 1942. As he signed the last page, his pen trembled slightly. Not from doubt, but from the awareness that every word was pulling back a 40-year curtain on a murder hidden by silence and paperwork. On the desk, the sealed hydroline vial sat inside its small glass evidence box. Light refracting through it cast a faint blue streak across the tabletop. The same pale blue shade of ink Helen had once used to sign her name. Now the final silent testimony of the victim. She had not left. She had been killed. Immediately after the toxicology results confirmed Helen Mayfield died by poisoning, Calloway shifted focus to the documentary evidence, the 2 items originally accepted in 1942 as proof of voluntary departure. The handwritten letter signed Helen M. and the 1943 power of attorney for the land sale. He knew that proving both documents forged would collapse the entire stage scene Ruth Keating had created. A new lead emerged unexpectedly from Margaret Lenz, Helen's niece. When she traveled to Lincoln to sign the DNA acknowledgement, Margaret brought an old family envelope containing a 1940 photograph of Helen and Ruth at church and a 1958 letter Ruth had sent to Margaret's mother. The handwriting was rounded, evenly spaced, and slightly right-slanted, the same style Calloway had seen in the old files. He immediately requested permission to borrow it as a comparison sample. At the same time, Ruth's granddaughter Carol, who had discovered the notebook containing the line, "No one is ever to break up that silo floor," forwarded the original notebook to FBI Lincoln. Though faded, the writing inside remained legible. Calloway sent all these materials to the Nebraska State Document Examination Laboratory for parallel analysis against the Helen M. letter. The lab used optical comparison microscopy to examine microscopic stroke details, pen stops, and pressure patterns. The preliminary report, signed by document analyst Leslie Perrin 3 weeks later, stated, "Comparison between the 1942 letter and Ruth Keating's recovered 1981 diary shows significant handwriting congruence. 16 morphological matches identified, including 12 degrees slant, reverse flick on capital A, double loop structure on capital M, uniform letter width 2.1, 2.3 mm, and distinctive E, ligature loop. Minor pressure variations, attributable to different ink or pen, insufficient to exclude common authorship." Calloway held the report and reread the figure, 16 matching points. Under state lab standards, 12 points were sufficient to declare common authorship. That meant the letter found in Helen's desk drawer in 1942 had not been written by Helen, it was Ruth Keating's work. The final report, dated December 4, 1982 was unequivocal. Forgery confirmed. Letter signed Helen M., written by Ruth Keating. Authenticity score, 98.6%. Signature and line rhythm consistent with Keating's known handwriting. The 1943 power of attorney was analyzed simultaneously. Results showed near-identical characteristics, same slant, same elongated E, and the dot over I consistently placed to the right. This reinforced the conclusion that both documents were produced by Ruth during the same brief period, using the same dark blue Parker ink she continued to use in her family diary. Callaway convened a meeting with Sheriff Garner and the Hall County prosecutor. He projected enlarged images onto the screen. The magnified M from the 1942 letter placed beside the M from Ruth's diary. Parallel curves, identical light downward tail. Next, the signature Helen M., the heesh slanted 12 degrees, initial downstroke straight then flicked, left, exactly how Ruth signed her own name in the 1958 letter. As the lights dimmed, Callaway spoke slowly. This is not just forged signature. This is staged crime scene fabrication. Ruth wrote the letter and planted it in the desk to make everyone believe Helen left voluntarily. He pointed to the timeline. The letter was written immediately after Helen disappeared. A year later, she filed the power of attorney with the same forged signature, both products of the same hand. The prosecutor stared at the report and said quietly, "So the concealment was planned from the start." Callaway nodded, "Exactly. And now we have scientific proof." In the consolidated report to FBI Omaha he wrote, "Document analysis. The 1942 letter and 1943 property authorization are both confirmed forgeries authored by Ruth Keating, based on 16 identical stroke characteristics verified by state forensic examiners." In the notes section he added by hand forgery, deliberate intent to mislead investigation, motive probable, concealment of homicide. When the meeting ended, Callaway returned to his desk, switched on the small desk lamp, and illuminated the 1942 black and white photograph of Whitman standing beside the silo, notebook in hand. Under that light, he placed the new forensic report next to the old photo and gave a sad half smile. "You were right, Harold. She never left. And that signature was never hers." Outside the window, wind moved down the long Lincoln Courthouse hallway, rustling papers, a faint sound like a belated confirmation that truth, though buried for 40 years, would one day resurface on its own, revealed in every ink stroke the killer had unwittingly left behind. Immediately after the handwriting analysis confirmed that Ruth Keating was the one who forged the Helen M. letter, Callaway shifted focus to a complete review of Helen Mayfield's financial records and property ownership for the period 1942-1943. He requested the original power of attorney document for the land sale that Ruth had submitted 40 years earlier from the Nebraska State Land Office, while simultaneously sending a formal request to the Federal Archives to open the old civilian fingerprint files for the state. When the documents arrived, Callaway and his team of technicians examined every page under digital microscopes. The original power of attorney was preserved in a glass sleeve. The writing was still sharp, and the signature Helen Mayfield was unusually thick and heavily emphasized on the "ye", a feature absent from Helen's genuine signatures on bank records. What caught Callaway's attention most was a faint fingerprint smudged on the lower right edge of the page, possibly left when the signer accidentally touched the wet notary ink. He ordered high-resolution photographs of the print and sent them to the FBI's analysis lab at Quantico. 4 days later, the report came back. Partial fingerprint recovered from the 1943 property document matches right index fingerprint of Ruth Keating, record filed 1951. In other words, the fingerprint on the power of attorney was not Helen Mayfield's, it was Ruth Keating's physical proof that Ruth had personally handled and signed the document in the transaction. Callaway finished reading, set the report down, and sat in silence for several minutes. He knew he had just touched the final link. Motive. He and the team traced Helen's old bank transactions from the 1942 files, an account at Farmers and Merchants Bank, with a balance of nearly $270 and no withdrawals in the 3 weeks before her disappearance. Yet by June 1943, the account was closed, and the entire balance withdrawn by a check made out to Ruth Keating, authorized proxy. The signature authorizing the withdrawal matched the one on the land sale power of attorney. When they cross-referenced the ledgers, they discovered that the full proceeds from the farm sale, $1,800, had also been deposited into Ruth's personal account at the same bank and gradually withdrawn over the following year. There was no refund, no correspondence from anyone claiming to be Helen Mayfield. Callaway compiled the data and reconstructed the financial timeline. July 1942. Helen disappears. May 1943. Ruth forges the power of attorney. June sells the land and withdraws all cash. July, closes the account. Then she left Grand Island. Every detail fit perfectly. There was no longer any room for the helping a friend manage her assets explanation. In the internal report submitted to the Hall County prosecutor, Callaway wrote, "Evidence shows deliberate forgery and financial gain. Motive established acquisition of property and financial assets of Helen Mayfield." He pinned a red diagram on the briefing room board, showing the chain of actions: forgery, property sale, withdrawal, disappearance. Beneath it, he wrote by hand, "Not a crime of passion, but of possession." When the prosecutor finished reading, he sighed. She didn't just want the money. She wanted to erase the real owner completely. Callaway nodded, eyes fixed on a newly located church archive photograph of a young Ruth Keating, stern face, hard jaw, direct gaze. She understood the law, he said. Notarized power of attorney in Lincoln. Legitimate notary seal. She knew how to create a legal escape route for her crime. He added to the interim conclusion, fingerprint identifies Ruth Keating as directly handling the power of attorney document. No evidence of contact with Helen after 1942. Transactions constitute appropriation concealed through civil contract. When the meeting ended, Callaway stayed behind alone to reorganize the files. He placed the power of attorney next to the handwriting analysis and the copy of Ruth's fingerprint. 3 pieces that now formed a complete picture: forged writing, real fingerprint, real money. Outside the window, dusk fell, red light spilling across the desk where case hash 241, reopened, was printed in bold on the folder cover. He picked up a pen and added one small line in black ink. Motivation confirmed, property appropriation following homicide. As he capped the pen, Callaway knew the Helen Mayfield case was no longer a hazy mystery in an old town's memory. It had become living proof of a meticulously planned crime in which greed and legal knowledge combined into the perfect tool to bury a human life for 40 years beneath the cold concrete of Nebraska. After definitively establishing the motive of asset appropriation, Callaway continued reviewing the list of everyone who had participated in the 1942 investigation. Most were deceased, but personnel records still listed Deputy Earl Danner, the officer who, along with Harold Whitman, had been first on scene. Danner died in 1969, but his son, Edward Danner, was still alive in Hastings and had worked as a civil engineer. Callaway visited him in late December 1982 at a small wooden house beside Highway 281. When the Grand Island disappearance was mentioned, Edward paused for a long time, then quietly went inside and returned with a yellowed envelope, saying, "My father kept this in his desk drawer for over 20 years. After he died, I never understood what it meant. But now, maybe someone needs to know." Inside were 3 sheets of faint blue ink notes written in haste, the corners still carrying traces of cigarette smoke. On the top of the second page, a clear line read, "Wanted to dig silo, blocked." Ruth said no need, said new foundation just poured. Below it, a shorter note, Whitman suspected leveling but agreed to hold off. Recorded morning 21/7. Callaway read every line carefully and cross-checked it against Whitman's original log. Yes. On the morning of July 21st, Whitman had noted, ground behind silo flat, unusual. Danner had wanted to dig a test hole, but Ruth Keating stopped him, claiming the concrete was just mixed. Still wet, don't break it. Danner's note was independent evidence that Whitman's initial suspicion had merit, and that Ruth had personally intervened to prevent examination of the exact area where Helen's body was later found. Calloway ordered handwriting analysis to confirm authenticity. The Lincoln lab verified that the writing matched Earl Danner's signature in 1942 duty records, undeniably genuine. The discovery was added to Case 241 as new evidence item 24, Danner's field note. But what drew Calloway's attention even more was a small detail on the back of the last sheet. An underlined phrase, Ruth present evening, 17/7. Green truck. He asked Edward, "Do you know what this truck refers to?" Edward thought for a moment and said slowly, "Dad told me that when they arrived to check, Ruth said she had driven with Helen the previous morning in the farm's small produce truck. But on the evening of the 17th, Dad saw that same truck parked at the farm while Helen was supposedly at church." That detail made Calloway stop. If Ruth was there on the evening of July 17th, she had returned to the farm the night before Helen vanished, the only window with no witnesses. He had the tech team digitize Danner's notes and enlarge the green truck portion. The vehicle described was identified as a Chevrolet 1.5-ton pickup, the same model Ruth owned while working at the grain elevator. That same day, Calloway phoned Sheriff Garner. "We have an indirect witness confirming Ruth Keating's presence at the farm the night of the disappearance." Garner replied briefly, "Enough for the motive file." That evening, Calloway added to the interim report, "Statement corroborates Ruth Keating's presence on July 17, 1942, at Mayfield Farm. Obstruction of search confirmed." He pinned Danner's note to the board beside the farm map, marking the silo location in red with the annotation, "Planned concealment, excavation blocked by Ruth." Looking across the board, everything now aligned. Ruth at the farm evening of 17th. Helen disappears that night. Lights left on morning of 18th. Danner wants to dig silo on 21st and is stopped. 1 year later, Ruth submits forged power of attorney to sell the land. Every marker formed a seamless chain of conduct, no longer speculation. Finally, Calloway returned Danner's notes to the original envelope, sealed and signed it, and delivered it to evidence storage. Before leaving the office, he looked once more at the faint blue writing that still carried the scent of old ink. Wanted to dig silo, blocked a small note that had seemed meaningless for decades, had become living evidence, confirming that from the summer of 1942, the only person determined to keep that silo foundation untouched was the same person who had buried the truth beneath it. After verifying Ruth Keating's presence at the farm the night Helen disappeared, Calloway decided to conduct a full crime scene reconstruction, one of the most labor-intensive yet highest-value procedures in cold case work. The goal was to determine the probable sequence of events at Mayfield Farm on the night of July 17, 1942, using Whitman's records, Danner's notes, and the new forensic findings. The FBI Lincoln technical team used 1940 survey maps, USDA aerial photographs, and surviving original scene photos to recreate the farm's layout. Simulation software was calibrated to actual sunlight direction and sun position for that date and time to recreate shadows, window lines of sight, and distances from the main house to the silo and barns. From this, Calloway and the team tested 3 hypotheses: Helen left the property and was abducted, was poisoned elsewhere, or was killed inside the house. After comparing all physical evidence, bone fractures, pelvic drag marks, burial location, and soil contaminated with tetrahydrozoline, only the third hypothesis matched perfectly. The reconstructed scenario was as follows. Helen was in the kitchen after evening church services on July 17th and very likely drank something laced with tetrahydrozoline from the recovered hydroline bottle. Based on the amount found in the bones, the toxicologist determined the victim lost consciousness within 10 minutes and then stopped breathing. As rigor mortis began, the perpetrator, most likely Ruth Keating, dragged the body out the back door, across the small yard to the silo area, about 30 yards away. The ground there was still soft from recently mixed foundation concrete, making temporary burial easy. Under the simulated lighting model, Calloway could see that the path from kitchen to silo was completely hidden from the main road, and only visible from the north field, where there were no witnesses that night. During transport, the simulation showed the victim's hip and shoulder, subjected to angled dragging force that exactly matched the forensic results. Minor fracture at the right, greater trochanter-oriented posterior to anterior, indicating the body was dragged rather than carried, and a cracked left scapula consistent with being gripped and pulled across hard ground. When Calloway looked at the 3D screen, the simulated figure of Helen appeared, slender build, light-colored dress, collapsing onto the kitchen floor beside the table. He pointed out to the technicians the likely poisoning location next to the sink, where an old scene photo showed a circular stain. Spectral analysis of the black and white image revealed different light reflection in that area, suggesting dried liquid residue, most likely spilled tetrahydrozoline solution. The simulation moved to the second scene, the perpetrator dragging the body out the back door, leaving faint drag marks on the soil. Under July moonlight, Ruth, according to the team's visualization, could have wrapped the body in coarse cloth or tarpaulin and pulled it. Forensic experts noted this matched the rotted fabric fragments found beside the tin box in the grave, items that could have been used to wrap the corpse. Beneath the silo, the 60 centimeters layer of clay and lime-mixed sand showed evidence of one excavation and refill. When the team simulated the burial structure, the depth exactly matched the location of the recovered bones. Calloway asked for one more detail. Assuming the perpetrator worked alone, how long to bury? The modeling engineer calculated approximately 40 minutes with a standard farm shovel. This explained why neighbors noticed no unusual lights or noise. The work fell between 22:30 and 23:10, the exact window Ruth claimed she was at home asleep. The preliminary report stated, scene reconstruction indicates poisoning occurred in kitchen area. Body transported approximately 30 yards to silo, burial depth and bone fracture consistent with dragging motion. Calloway ordered a 1/100 scale 3D model printed for the file, and still frames illustrating the movement path. When he placed the model on the table, he pointed to the kitchen. This is where it began, where Helen drank the poison. From here to here, tracing his finger along the arrow to the silo, was her final journey. The team fell silent, except for the steady sound of the printer. A young forensic technician whispered, "If Whitman had dug then," Calloway cut him off, eyes darkening, "then Ruth might not have lived in peace for another 40 years. The complete report was sent to Hall County headquarters with 14 model photographs, 2 bone fracture direction charts, and a lighting diagram for the night of July 17, 1942. In the conclusion, Calloway wrote clearly, "The reconstructed sequence aligns with forensic and witness data. Victim likely poisoned inside kitchen, transported post-mortem to silo foundation for burial. Bone damage corroborates dragging from rear entrance to silo path. Scene consistent with deliberate concealment." Once the report was stamped, the Helen Mayfield case was no longer theory or guesswork. It had been rebuilt with evidence, science, and fragments of memory long forgotten. Finally reshaping one July night in 1942, the night a woman was poisoned in her own home, and the truth buried deep behind the wall where the lights burned all night. After completing the scene reconstruction and verifying the entire chain of criminal conduct, Calloway and the Cold Case Unit team drafted the final Helen Mayfield case report for submission to the Nebraska State Prosecutor. The report was nearly 200 pages long and divided into 4 main sections: forensic evidence, financial records, forged documents, and criminal investigation conclusions. In the small conference room in Lincoln, Calloway sat at the center of the table, surrounded by thick labeled folders in red ink. He opened the first section, Forensic Findings. Analysis confirmed the remains found beneath the Mayfield farm silo, belonged to Helen Mayfield, female, age 28, missing since July 1942. Toxicology results determined death by high-concentration tetrahydrozolanine poisoning. The source was pure hydroline solution recovered with the body. Chemical traces in soil and bone proved the poison was ingested before death, ruling out suicide. Rotted cloth fragments and the tin box beside the remains were consistent with materials used to wrap and conceal the body. Pelvic fracture resulted from dragging. Direction of movement matched the reconstruction model. The second section, financial and property records, detailed the full appropriation sequence. The 1943 power of attorney land sale document bearing Ruth Keating's fingerprint and forged Helen Mayfield's signature. The victim's bank account emptied by checks signed by Ruth. Bank statements confirming all funds transferred to Ruth Keating's personal account at Farmers and Merchants Bank. The report also attached 1943 archive statements from now deceased bank employees confirming Ruth personally conducted the transaction. The third section, document analysis, contained results for both the Helen M. letter and the 1943 power of attorney, both written in Ruth Keating's hand, matching 16 characteristic stroke features and using the same dark blue Parker ink. Ruth's fingerprint on the power of attorney matched her 1951 civilian record. This constituted irrefutable proof that Ruth forged documents to create a false narrative and seize the victim's assets. The fourth section, motive and circumstantial evidence, compiled all witness investigations and Deputy Earl Danner's notes, independent evidence, proving Ruth was present at the farm the evening of July 17, 1942, and personally prevented excavation of the silo foundation on the 21st. The conduct was determined to be premeditated. Ruth poisoned Helen with tetrahydrozolanine, concealed the body beneath the silo foundation, forged letters, appropriated assets, and left Grand Island after legalizing ownership. Scientific, financial, and testimonial evidence were unanimous with no contradictions. The cold case unit's conclusion was delivered calmly but carried the weight of 40 years of silence. Based on cumulative forensic, financial, and documentary evidence, the death of Helen Mayfield is conclusively ruled as homicide by poisoning committed between July 17, 1942, at Mayfield Farm, Hall County, Nebraska. The perpetrator, identified through physical and circumstantial evidence, is Ruth Keating. The report emphasized that although the suspect was deceased, posthumous establishment of criminal responsibility was required to complete judicial records and clear the victim's name. Callaway wrote clearly in the recommendation section, recommend posthumous prosecution filing, first-degree homicide, with motive of financial gain and deliberate concealment. Case should be closed by conviction in absentia to restore legal standing of the victim. He also requested that all physical evidence, the hydroline bottle, cloth fragments, handwritten letters, power of attorney, and Danner's notes, be transferred to state archives for permanent preservation. When the final report was printed, he signed the last page in bold ink, Thomas Callaway, Special Agent, FBI Cold Case Unit, beneath the certification line. At the same time, Sheriff Garner signed confirmation to close the investigation, case #241, reclassified, homicide. At a brief press conference in the Lincoln Courthouse, Callaway summarized the findings. Every piece of evidence points to one person, Ruth Keating. Her sole purpose was to seize the property of the woman she once called sister. We conclude Helen Mayfield never left Grand Island. She was murdered and buried behind her own house. The room was silent, except for pens signing the minutes. Outside, Nebraska was covered in fog. Passers-by had no idea that after 4 decades, a seemingly hopeless missing person case finally had its answer. Callaway looked down at the closed report, breathed slowly, and wrote one small line in the margin, "Justice delayed, but not denied." In February 1983, nearly 8 months after the Cold Case Unit released its investigative findings, the Hall County Court issued a notice to hold a public inquest. a formal public hearing to examine the evidence and issue an official ruling on the death of Helen Mayfield, a case that had remained sealed as unresolved for over 40 years. On the morning of February 14th, Courtroom 2 in the Grand Island Courthouse was packed. Local reporters, law students, and residents from surrounding areas arrived early, many carrying photocopies of the 1942 newspaper article titled "Mystery Woman Vanishes from Mayfield Farm." At the inquiry table sat Judge Raymond Cole, presiding, alongside a 5-member citizens' jury drawn from Hall County. In the front row sat Nebraska State Prosecutor Lawrence Hines, beside FBI Cold Case Unit Special Agent Thomas Calloway, who had led the reinvestigation. The hearing began with a brief statement from Judge Cole. "We are gathered here to determine, under the laws of the state of Nebraska, the cause and perpetrator of the death that occurred at Mayfield Farm in 1942. Although the accused is no longer living, justice still demands to be recorded." Following the opening, Prosecutor Hines presented the Cold Case Unit's consolidated report, divided into 3 categories of evidence. The first category, forensic, covered the examination of the remains, confirming the victim was Helen Mayfield and that she died from lethal dose tetrahydrozoline poisoning. He held up before the court the photograph of the glass hydroline bottle and described the analysis process. The liquid in this bottle, found beside the remains, contained pure tetrahydrozoline, an odorless, tasteless poison. The victim could not have prepared it herself. The concentration was so high it could only have been deliberately compounded. The room fell completely silent as he projected enlarged forensic images onto the screen. Porous bone samples containing toxin crystals and a 3D reconstruction of the burial site beneath the silo floor. Hines continued. The perpetrator mixed in lime and poured concrete to conceal it. The burial characteristics matched the exact location Deputy Danner wanted to excavate in 1942, but was prevented from doing so. And the person who stopped him was Ruth Keating. Moving to the second category, financial and legal documents, the prosecutor presented authenticated records, the 1943 power of attorney land sale document bearing Ruth's fingerprints and a forged Helen Mayfield signature, bank checks and statements showing Helen's entire estate had been transferred to Ruth's accounts. When the side-by-side fingerprint comparison appeared on screen, murmurs rippled through the gallery. Hines tapped his pen lightly. No amount of sophistry can deny this. These are Ruth Keating's actual fingerprints on legal instruments used to seize the property of a woman already dead. The third category, witness statements and motive, included Deputy Danner's notes, his son's testimony, and Agent Calloway's report. Hines slowly read the handwritten 1942 entry, wanted to dig silo prevented. Ruth said floor newly poured. He looked up at the gallery. That was the only sentence spoken in 1942, and 40 years later we know why that floor was never dug. After the presentation, Hines stepped down, yielding the floor to Agent Calloway. He stood without notes, holding only an old church portrait of Helen. Every trace leads to the same conclusion. Helen Mayfield was poisoned in her own kitchen, her body dragged out back, buried beneath the silo floor, and the only person with the ability, means, and motive to do it was Ruth Keating. He displayed the simulated map, pointing out the body's path, drag marks, and fracture patterns consistent with being pulled. The room sank into silence as the reconstruction played moonlight falling over the farmyard on the night of July 17, 1942. When the presentations concluded, Judge Cole asked the jury, "Do you require any clarification before deliberating?" One member asked about possible accomplices. Hines replied, "There is no trace or data indicating a second individual. The crime was planned and executed meticulously by one person acting alone." The jury deliberated for nearly 2 hours. When they returned, the judge called for the verdict. Jury foreperson Eleanor Grayson stood, her hands trembling slightly around the document. "Based on scientific, financial, and witness evidence, we conclude that Helen Mayfield was intentionally killed on the night of July 17, 1942, in Grand Island, Nebraska. The person responsible for this act was Ruth Keating. Verdict: first-degree homicide, guilty. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds before whispers mixed with indescribable emotion filled the air. A reporter from the Grand Island Independent bowed his head and quickly wrote the headline, "Helen Mayfield Case. Justice After 40 Years." Judge Cole delivered the final pronouncement. The Hall County Court, State of Nebraska, officially recognizes the death of Helen Mayfield as the result of first-degree murder. Though tried posthumously, the case is recorded as solved in the state's criminal files. He struck the gavel 3 times. The sound echoed heavily and decisively through the old wooden room. After the inquest, Calloway stood quietly as the gallery emptied. On the inquiry table, Helen's photograph remained neatly placed beneath the yellow light. He gathered the files and stepped outside into the chilly early spring Nebraska air. Across the street, an elderly woman, Margaret Lenz, was wiping tears. As he passed, she said softly, "Finally." They called her by her real name. Calloway only nodded slightly. He knew that for the people of Grand Island, the Helen Mayfield case was not just a closed murder. It was a reminder of an era when justice seemed lost, now restored, slowly but surely, in a community that had stayed silent too long. 1 month after the Hall County public inquest, the Federal Bureau of Investigation directed Special Agent Thomas Calloway to prepare an internal case report, a comprehensive after-action review of the entire Helen Mayfield investigation to draw operational lessons for the National Cold Case Unit system. The nearly 80-page report, stamped confidential, was sent directly to Washington, D.C., at the end of March 1983. In the introduction, Calloway stated the objective clearly: to analyze the reasons the Mayfield case remained unsolved for an unreasonable length of time and to recommend improvements in processing unresolved missing persons cases. The report identified 3 primary reasons the case lay dormant for 4 decades. First, technological and forensic limitations of the 1940s. At that time, toxin screening was not routine in rural counties, especially for synthetic compounds like tetrahydrozoline, which was not yet on the state's poison schedule. Whitman and Danner did everything within their capability, but they lacked chemical analysis equipment or soil sampling tests. Contemporary medical literature still treated accidental eye drop ingestion as a common mishap, so homicide by poisoning was never considered. Calloway noted, imprecise science caused a death to be misinterpreted as voluntary disappearance. Second, excessive reliance on informal witnesses. The 1942 file shows Ruth Keating was treated as the victim's closest associate, so local police depended almost entirely on her statements to set the investigative direction. There was no cross-verification, no recorded interviews, and the original file contained only a single-page handwritten summary. This subjectivity turned the sole suspect into the central witness. Calloway commented, "Familiarity is not proof of truth." Third, flaws in federal archival and handoff procedures. In 1945, File 241 was transferred to Nebraska State Storage, labeled Unresolved, Voluntary Departure Possible. No federal copy was retained, and no electronic index existed due to post-war manpower shortages. When Ruth died in 1981, no mechanism existed to cross-check estates against cold cases. Calloway wrote, "A paper-only administrative system allowed evidence to remain in darkness for nearly half a century." The report also highlighted positive aspects. The meticulous efforts of Whitman and Danner, despite their era's constraints, left valuable notes and scene diagrams that later enabled the cold case team to reconstruct events. Calloway called it a quiet investigative legacy. The next section focused on recommended improvements to cold case training and procedures. Calloway proposed 3 core measures. 1. Every missing person file must pursue 2 parallel theories, voluntary departure and foul play, until evidence eliminates 1. 2. All original documents, including handwritten letters and civil powers of attorney, must be microfilmed and assigned unique identifiers to prevent loss. 3. Every 10 years, long-dormant missing person files must be automatically reviewed by the Federal Cold Case Division, regardless of local requests. He stressed that the Mayfield case demonstrated a human life can be buried not by the sophistication of the criminal, but by the impatience of the system. Callaway also recommended establishing a historical forensics training course to teach investigators how to read, preserve, and interpret aged evidence, including ink analysis, handwriting, and chemical stains on paper. He concluded, "Old cases don't just need new machines, they need eyes that know how to look backward." The report was forwarded to the Special Investigations Oversight Office on March 29, 1983, accompanied by a handwritten note from Callaway to the Cold Case Unit Director. Case 241 shows justice doesn't vanish on its own. It just needs someone patient enough to retrieve it. Every pending file is an unfinished story, and we, the ones who come later, must write the ending for them. Once stamped complete, the Helen Mayfield file officially became a model training document in the National Cold Case Curriculum, an exemplar of how truth can remain buried, not because the crime was too clever, but because of misplaced trust and the limitations of its time. When Callaway's internal report was distributed in the 1984 Quantico Special Training Program, the Helen Mayfield case was formally added to the Historical Case Studies Catalog, a series of benchmark files used to illustrate investigative progress across eras. In subsequent cold case classes, instructors routinely opened lectures with two side-by-side images on the left. Sheriff Harold Whitman's 1942 handwritten note, slanted and ink-blotted. On the right, the 1982 digital DNA analysis results. The two photographs, 4 decades apart, vividly illustrated the shift from human intuition to forensic science. Callaway himself said at a 1985 workshop, "Whitman saw what was right, but he lacked the tools to prove it. We have the tools, and we must learn never to let what is right fall into oblivion simply because evidence was missing." In the 1940s, investigators relied primarily on memory, verbal statements, and personal judgment. Files were handwritten, stored in wooden cabinets with no copies. Accuracy depended entirely on the lead investigators' experience. Whitman and Danner's generation operated on gut feeling, on noticing unusually flat ground, or a light that never went out. That intuition was honed in the field, yet easily overridden by administrative pressure and trust in familiar faces. Callaway's generation entered an era of mass spectrometers, 3D modeling, DNA profiling, and federal databases. Truth no longer hinged on recollection, but on measurable, comparable, storable, and recoverable data. This is why Cold Case #241 became the classic illustration of a dual lesson: the persistence of the old guard and the tools of the new must walk together to deliver justice. At the FBI Academy, the Mayfield case was incorporated into the Evolution of Forensic Methodology module, where trainees compared 1942 note-taking practices with 2009 digital case management systems. One slide stated, 1942, investigation log. One notebook, handwritten 12 entries, 2009, digital case management, 2 terabytes of cross-reference data. Beneath the heading, the instructor added, the truth was always there, waiting for the tools to catch up. Trainees were required to read the entire original file and rewrite the report as if they were investigators in each respective era. The exercise revealed differences not only in technology, but in mindset. In 1942, the goal was identify a suspect, find someone capable of the crime. By 2009, the goal was validate the evidence chain, find facts that cannot be refuted. That paradigm shift reshaped 21st century cold case thinking. Callaway's report, originally the document that closed the case, was reissued in 2009 as FBI Training Reference Number 12-241 for Forensic Specialist Training. The cover bore the subtitle, From Guesswork to Evidence, the case that redefined persistence. At the 2009 National Cold Case Conference in Denver, the FBI Academy director cited Mayfield as a milestone. One small-town officer in 1942 wrote 2 lines about flat ground. 67 years later, those 2 lines were proven correct by 3D modeling, chemistry, DNA, and financial records. That is the distance between suspicion and truth, bridged by technology and the memory of people who refuse to forget. Young specialists listened as the screen displayed case #241, solved 1982, studied 2009. Calloway had retired by then, but his report continued to be quoted in the Forensic Persistence and Data Integrity curriculum. The manual reprinted a sentence he had handwritten in the margin of his 1983 report: "Every file holds 2 stories, one about a crime, and one about those who tried to understand it." Thus, the Helen Mayfield case became not only proof of technical progress, but also of humanity's learned humility before time. In 1942, the truth lay hidden under dirt. In 1982, it was unearthed by tools. By 2009, it had become a lesson taught to those who would continue the journey. And in every Quantico training session, when the final slide appeared reading Mayfield Farm, Nebraska 1942, the room fell silent. Everyone understood that between Whitman's intuition and Calloway's data, the one thing keeping justice alive across every era was something unchanging, unwavering determination to find the truth, even if it takes a lifetime. In June 1983, after all administrative procedures and FBI follow-up reports were completed, the Nebraska Department of Justice issued the final legal decision in the Helen Mayfield case. Under reference number State File 240-142HC, the case status was recorded as solved homicide by poisoning. It was the first case in state judicial history to be classified posthumously solved, where the perpetrator was deceased, but scientific evidence conclusively proved the crime. The decision carried the same legal weight as a jury conviction and was entered into the Federal Department of Justice crime database for cold case research purposes. Hall County Sheriff Garner signed the case closure document on June 22 beneath the bold line, "Case #241, Mayfield, Helen, reclassified, solved." That same day, all paper files, crime scene photographs, examination reports, forged letters, powers of attorney, the hydroline bottle, fragments of rotted fabric, and Deputy Danner's notebook were sealed in 6 specialized archival boxes. Each item received its own number and laser-etched metal tag for permanent traceability. The Nebraska State Repository created a dedicated climate-controlled section for closed cold cases. All original evidence was placed in double-locked stainless steel containers, sealed with lead by representatives of the Hall County Court and the FBI Omaha Field Office. Under the repository's white lights, the items looked ordinary and still. The small glass bottle with clear residue, cloth gloves embroidered HM, faded brown fabric scraps, and the notebook ending with the line, "No one is to break up the silo floor." Each object, once a fragment of a mystery, had become a witness to justice found too late. Administratively, the case was entered into the Nebraska State Digital Archive under Code NCSC 241-1942, with restricted research access granted to forensic agencies, investigative academies, and criminal justice graduate students. The electronic cover page carried the brief description: "Case reopened 1982, solved 1983. Offender deceased, motive, financial gain. Forensic confirmation tetrahydrozoline poisoning." When Calloway signed off on the final evidence transfer, he added by hand in the note, "Not every case needs a sentence to be closed, but every truth deserves to be recorded." Beginning in 1984, the Mayfield file was placed in the closed historical records section, alongside other famous Midwest cold cases. Each year, archivists continued routine humidity checks, replaced desiccant packs, and dusted the metal boxes. By regulation, all physical evidence is to be preserved indefinitely, never destroyed. as both legal heritage and training material for future generations of investigators. By year-end 1983, the final FBI Omaha report to Washington confirmed all physical, forensic, financial, and witness evidence has been verified, cross-checked, and stored according to protocol. Case hash 241 is considered complete with no outstanding appeals or additional requirements. When the red solved stamp hit the last page, the file closed with the crisp sound of the metal cover. In the cold storage room, the lights dimmed automatically, leaving only a faint glow reflecting off the hydroline bottle, a thin, dim but enduring light, as if to remind us that justice, however delayed, can still shine through time. In October 1983, almost half a year after the Helen Mayfield file was stamped solved, Special Agent Thomas Calloway received his final assignment on the case to prepare the final summary report, a 112-page comprehensive document covering the entire investigative process and operational outcomes, submitted to the FBI Director and the Nebraska Institute of Justice. Designated FBI Cold Case 241. It became a model text for combined forensic, financial, documentary, and historical witness methodology. In the introduction, Calloway wrote, "The Mayfield case is a classic example that time cannot erase traces if people know how to look back with science." He structured the summary in 3 phases: 1942, Era of Intuitive Investigation, 1982, Phase of Re-excavation and Testing, 1983, Legal Conclusion. In the first section, he gave full credit to the previous generation, especially Sheriff Harold Whitman and Deputy Earl Danner, men who lacked equipment but possessed integrity, for laying the foundation modern investigators built upon. Calloway recounted the timeline from the moment construction workers broke the silo floor and discovered remains, to DNA confirmation of the victim's identity. Every step rested on the marriage of science and intuition. He listed in detail the forensic disciplines applied: skeletal excavation and age determination, infrared spectroscopy, toxin analysis, electronic fingerprint comparison, and handwriting pressure stroke analysis, all completed in 8 months, 3 times faster than the average cold case. In the second section, Calloway devoted many pages to the value of interdisciplinary convergence, calling it a case of convergence, where every specialty met at one point. Forensics established cause of death, financial records revealed motive, handwriting analysis proved deception, and historical witnesses supplied the final link. He emphasized, no single discipline could have solved the case alone. Only when the pieces joined did the truth emerge. The report cited 27 items of physical evidence, 8 expert reports, 3 banking documents, and 2 handwritten notes, all coded and cross-referenced in the federal system. Calloway again analyzed why the case languished nearly 4 decades, attributing it to 3 factors already used by the FBI to improve the national cold case model: technical limitations, blind trust in witnesses, and outdated archiving. In the operational assessment section, he wrote, "Case hash 241 has become the textbook example of forensic reconstruction, rebuilding a decades-old scene from remaining traces. Through 3D simulation and skeletal analysis, we proved both the mechanism of death and the body's post-mortem journey, something impossible in 1942. He stressed the importance of forensic integrity and evidence preservation. Every item, no matter how small, has its own voice. The hydroline bottle, the fabric scraps, and the notebook seemingly worthless became the 3 pillars that illuminated the entire chain of events." He quoted Whitman's old notebook entry, "Ground behind silo, unusually flat," and added beside it, "Sometimes the truth resides in a note someone was once forced to ignore." The conclusion carried a rare emotional tone. Calloway recounted returning to Grand Island on the evening the file was closed, standing before the now leveled silo site. On the wide field, nothing remained except a small sign reading "Site of Mayfield Farm, 1942. He recorded his thoughts in the report's final line: "No one knows what the voice of justice sounds like, but I heard it, rising from the earth where Helen Mayfield lay. It was not loud, but it was clear, enough for a forgotten case to finally be called by its true name." On October 5, 1983, he signed the last page, sent the original to Washington, and a copy to Hall County. In the margin, he marked Classification, Model, Cold Case. Forensic reference. A year later, the report was printed internally at the FBI Academy with the note, The Callaway Report. An archetype of cold case perseverance. When Callaway left his Lincoln office, the final copy was sealed into the Nebraska State Archive, marking the end of a 41-year investigative journey. A journey closed by science, but opened by the steadfast belief of people who knew no case is ever truly buried by time. On November 12, 1983, exactly 1 month after Callaway's final report was approved, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in coordination with the Nebraska Department of Justice, carried out the formal handover and sealing of evidence, the last step in closing cold case, #241. The handover took place at the Lincoln Evidence Vault, the state-level evidence storage facility located in the Southern Administrative District of the city. The solid concrete building, equipped with automatic climate control and double magnetic doors, houses more than 5,000 historical criminal case files from the Midwest. Callaway, together with the state forensic representative, Dr. James Dalton, personally supervised the inventory process. On the long steel table, the items of evidence lay in individual trays, each labeled with its identification code, each 241. A for the hydroline glass vial, DOC 241. B for the forged letter signed Helen M. DO 241. C for the pair of embroidered cloth gloves marked each M. IMG 241. D for the set of 27 restored crime scene photographs taken in 1942. Each piece was given a final inspection before packaging. The hydroline vial remained intact. The clear liquid shimmered under the fluorescent lights, casting a faint blue glow on the walls. Callaway stared at it for a long moment, then ordered it placed in a UV protective glass case, wrapped in triple-layer thermal padding, and sealed with lead. The Helen M. letter was inserted into a silver-coated mylar sleeve, vacuum-sealed to preserve the ink. The forensic lab noted, handwriting still legible, ink pressure reduced by 12%, no restoration required. The gloves, the first evidence discovered on the farm fence in 1942, were gently folded and placed in their own box between 2 sheets of acid-free paper. The embroidery, each M, on the left glove was faded, but still readable. A small detail Callaway once called the last trace Helen left behind. The crime scene photographs were arranged in Whitman's original shooting order, from the house, the back door, the path to the silo, to the empty lot, all reprinted on archival silver paper and labeled with date and location. When sealing was complete, the state archivist read the official record aloud. All evidence pertaining to the Mayfield case, file number 241, is hereby formally transferred to the Lincoln Evidence Vault for permanent preservation. Case status, closed and archived. Callaway signed first, followed by Dr. Dalton, State Prosecutor Hines, and Hall County Sheriff Garner. The words, closed and archived, appeared in bold black at the bottom of the document, beneath the raised red seal of the Nebraska Department of Justice. After signing, Callaway walked to the large viewing window where technicians were placing the evidence boxes into the main vault. The thick steel door slowly closed with a mechanical echo that sounded like the final period after 41 years of investigation. He watched the electronic locks light up in sequence, then fade as the automated security system engaged. All the evidence now rested in a chamber maintained at a steady 18 degrees Celsius and 40% humidity, equipped with vibration and temperature sensors. Outside, Callaway signed the preservation log and wrote the final entry, all physical evidence secured, case officially closed. The pen he used was his old black Parker fountain pen, the same model Ruth had once used to forge the letter, an irony he noticed only after setting it down. As he left the vault, he glanced back through the glass, Among hundreds of identical metal boxes, the label 241, Mayfield, Helen glowed like a small beacon in the endless corridor. At the bottom of the storage manifest, in handwriting not part of the official form, Calloway added one private line: "Justice preserved is justice served." The box containing the hydrogen vial, the gloves, the letter, and the photographs closed the long journey of the case from the lime-covered silo floor to the cold storage vault in the heart of Lincoln. And when the vault door slammed shut, the dry, decisive sound of the electric motors marked the moment justice was preserved forever, no longer dependent on storytellers, but kept by the evidence itself and by time. Spring 2009, the western suburbs of Grand Island had changed beyond recognition. The fields that once belonged to the Mayfield farm were now owned by an agricultural corporation. The old silo had been demolished in the 1980s to make way for a new grain elevator, leaving only a gray, sunken foundation. Yet it was on that very spot, after numerous city council meetings and strong community support, that a small memorial stone was erected on July 17th, exactly 67 years after the night Helen Mayfield vanished. The marker was made of black granite with a simple inscription: "In memory of Helen Mayfield, she was found, and she was heard." Below, in smaller letters, added by the FBI Omaha Field Office, "Cold Case #241, Justice after 67 years." The dedication ceremony took place under a clear Nebraska sky. Students from Hall County High School brought wildflowers to place around the stone, joined by state justice officials and a few elderly residents who had once known Helen. In the crowd stood Margaret Lenz, Helen's only surviving cousin, holding for a long time an old photograph of Helen in a light-colored dress in front of the little wooden house. When it was her turn to speak, her voice trembled. "I no longer have anyone to blame or resent, but I know that, thanks to the people who never gave up, she finally has a place to come home to." After the ceremony, everyone bowed their heads in silence. Only the wind whistled through the young green corn, where a truth had been buried for far too long. At the back of the seating area, retired Special Agent Thomas Calloway, now nearly 20 years retired, stood quietly with his dark wooden cane. He looked at the stone, then out across the vast empty land where he had first set foot during the 1982 excavation. His hair was white, and his hands shook slightly, but his eyes still held the same focused intensity of a man who had walked an entire journey just to find one small truth. A young reporter recognized him and approached. "Sir, do you think justice came too late?" Calloway answered slowly. "Justice doesn't know time. It only knows whether people have enough patience to wait for it." That reply later appeared in bold on the front page of the Grand Island Independent, alongside a photograph of the memorial gleaming in the afternoon sun. A few months later, the Mayfield land was transformed by the agricultural company into a small memorial park, keeping the old silo's concrete foundation as the centerpiece. Beneath it lay the soil that had once been excavated, now covered with green grass and bearing a historical marker that read, "Here Cold Case #241 was solved in 1982, a symbol of the persistence of justice." Visitors to Grand Island still stop by, not to see a crime, but to witness a piece of community memory restored. In Lincoln, inside the public exhibit hall of the Nebraska State Forensic Laboratory, a display case numbered 241 stands near the entrance. Inside are replicas of the hydrogen vial, the cloth gloves, the forged Helen M. letter, and a reconstructed crime scene map. Beneath the glass, the plaque reads, "Case #241, Nebraska Cold Case Solved. Methods: DNA, toxicology, document forgery, model, forensic collaboration." Every year, FBI trainees and forensic students from across the country visit to hear again the story of a forgotten woman who was found through the intersection of science and determination. The Helen Mayfield case is recognized as a classic example of cold case forensics in the FBI Academy course. forensic persistence, alongside historic cases such as the Green River Killer and Amber Falls. In the introduction to the textbook, Calloway's words are still quoted: "There are no closed cases, only files that haven't yet been read the right way." On the cover, the subtitle reads, "Mayfield Farm, the case that time could not bury." In Grand Island, local authorities established the Helen Mayfield Fund to cover DNA testing costs for old missing persons cases, with the motto, "One more name, one more truth." At the fund's launch ceremony, a 17-year-old student named Lydia read aloud a passage from Calloway's report. "Every file holds two stories, one about the crime, one about the people trying to understand it." When she reached that line, the entire auditorium fell silent. Many had never known Helen, but they understood that her case was not just about one murdered woman. It had become a symbol of truth reborn through time. Even the youngest present saw in the story a reminder: justice does not vanish. It only needs someone brave enough to speak the name of the forgotten. At the FBI's Omaha field office, a small bronze plaque hangs in the cold case unit hallway. Helen Mayfield, Case #241, Solved, 1982. Memorialized 2009. Dedicated to the investigators who refused to forget. Beneath are engraved the names Whitman, Danner, and Calloway, followed by the words, "For their patience beyond time." Later that year, Calloway received a letter from the Lincoln Forensic Institute asking him to donate the black Parker pen he had used to sign the case closed. He agreed, and enclosed a small handwritten note. "A pen can close a file, but the truth never closes." The note was placed beside the pen under warm display lighting, a message from one generation of investigators to the next. That autumn, Calloway returned to Grand Island one last time. He stood before the memorial on the open field, placed a white daisy at its base, and looked silently at the quiet ground that had hidden a secret for so many years. He knew that, more than any file or verdict, this was the true marker of justice, when the dead are named, and the living know to bow their heads. That night, as he left the city, his headlights reflected off the old ground, where a small bronze sign glowed, "Cold Case #241, Solved," in the truck cab. Calloway opened his notebook and wrote his final private entry. Helen Mayfield, found 1982, laid to rest 2009. Justice took 67 years, but it came. He closed the notebook, set the pen on the seat, and looked down the long road bathed in sunset, heading west, toward the fields. Helen had walked on the last afternoon of her life. There, time had finally closed, but her story remained in the files, in the textbooks, in the small stone marker, and in the memory of a community that had once been silent too long. The Helen Mayfield case was officially closed with the final entry in the Nebraska State Records. Case #241, Solved, 1982. Justice delivered, 2009. Below in the archivist's small handwritten note, "This file will never be destroyed." And indeed, more than half a century later, in the cold storage vault of Lincoln, metal box number 241 still sits in its place, the faint light reflecting off the engraved word, Mayfield. There justice sleeps peacefully, needing no one to wake it, for its duty is complete. Giving voice to one who was buried, and bringing to an end the longest investigation in Nebraska history, a journey that began on a July night in 1942 and ended with a stone marker in the spring of 2009, where people can finally whisper with certainty, "She was found." The story of Helen Mayfield, the woman who disappeared in Nebraska in 1942, is not merely a case closed after 67 years, it is a mirror reflecting the spirit of American justice, slow, persistent, and never truly gone. Throughout the investigation, the early mistakes, from believing witness Ruth Keating to overlooking the silo because it had just been concreted, remind us that even the best systems can stray without skepticism and independent verification. In today's world, where technology races forward and people are swept up in the speed of information, The lesson of the must be even clearer: never let convenience or subjective belief obscure the pursuit of truth. What seemed like small details, Deputy Danner's note, "wanted to dig the silo," was stopped, or the embroidered HM gloves forgotten on the fence, became the very links that brought justice back. In modern American life, where forensic technology, digital data, and media can make a story disappear or explode in hours, this case teaches the value of steadfastness and professional integrity. Americans take pride in their legal system, but justice does not live only in courtrooms. It lives in the attitude of people like Special Agent Thomas Calloway, who believe that justice doesn't know time, it only waits for those patient enough to find it. The final lesson the Mayfield case leaves for American society today is this: every truth is worth finding, and every human being, even one lost in silence, deserves to be named once more, because that is how we preserve the soul of justice. If you believe justice, even when it arrives late, is still worth claiming, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring cases that time tried to bury. Thank you for following Helen Mayfield's journey. See you in the next episode, where another American mystery will be unveiled.